Hello fellow sapiens, and welcome to Sleepless Homo. This is a place to quiet your mind with slow storytelling, whether you're winding down before sleep, letting a long drive pass, cooking, showering, or working with headphones. If you appreciate this calm kind of science, humble, evidence-based, never wild speculation, consider liking and subscribing. It helps this long-form work reach others who might need a softer way to learn and sharpen their minds. I'd also love to know, do you use these stories to fall asleep? Or do you listen while working, travelling, or somewhere else entirely? Share your time and place. It's always fascinating to see how far sapiens carry these stories, and if you drift off along the way, no problem. I've put chapter timestamps in the description so you can pick up where you left off, because the story is worth following from beginning to end. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Tonight, we step into why humans are not evolved for modern life. Stone Age brains, city world problems. Imagine the world 300,000 years ago. No highways, no skylines, no buzzing of machines. Just open landscapes broken by patches of forest and water, with the occasional sheltering rock face where firelight flickered against stone walls. If you want to understand what kind of creatures we really are, this is the time to visit. The modern world is crowded and frantic, but the human mind was not formed in it. It was built in a place where survival meant belonging to a small group, where knowing every face around you could be the difference between life and death. So the question we begin with is simple. What kind of world were our minds actually shaped for? The answer lies in the lives of those early bands of Homo sapiens and their close cousins, who walked the African savannas and wooded valleys between 300,000 and 100,000 years ago. They lived in groups rarely larger than a few dozen, sometimes stretching to 100 or so at most. Within those bands, most were kin, or at least treated as such. People ate together, foraged together, and slept close to one another in shelters or caves. Each person was embedded in an unbroken web of obligations and trust. The brain that grew inside that social setting learned to track relationships, reputations and alliances, because ignoring such things could mean exclusion from the group, which almost always spelled death. The physical environment of those early humans was far more varied than the clichés of endless savannas might suggest. Fossil pollen, animal remains, and layers of sediment show that the climate of Africa in that era swung back and forth between wetter periods, with forests and rivers and drier stretches where grasslands spread wide. To survive meant flexibility. One season might offer roots and fruits, another might require hunting antelope or scavenging from lion kills. Fire offered warmth and protection, and caves offered stability against storms. But no one lived in one place forever. Camps shifted with the rains, with animal migrations, and with the changing needs of the group. The mind adapted not to permanent houses, but to impermanence itself. When you think of a cave today, it seems like a relic or a curiosity, a place to visit on holiday. But for those humans, the cave was more than stone. It was prime real estate. In regions like southern Africa, rock shelters provided a vantage point over valleys, protection from predators, and a consistent temperature across seasons. Excavations at sites such as Border Cave or Clayce's river mouth show layers upon layers of ash, stone tools, and animal bones. These are not brief stopovers, but repeated returns by groups who found safety in stone. The cave became a kind of anchor in an otherwise shifting world, and around its hearths human conversation, laughter, and planning shaped the rhythms of life. Still, life was never static. Unlike modern people who can thrive in vast anonymous cities, our ancestors' survival relied on intimate cooperation. Hunting large game took coordination and trust. Foraging for tubers required shared knowledge of which plants could kill and which could feed. Children needed years of care before they could contribute, demanding a communal investment far beyond what most mammals show. The human mind became exquisitely tuned to the nuances of cooperation. We watch faces, we listen for tone, we anticipate others' needs, because for hundreds of thousands of years those were not luxuries but necessities. Predators were real and constant. Lions, leopards, hyenas, and crocodiles claimed lives. But equally dangerous were the challenges of injury, infection, or starvation. A twisted ankle could make foraging impossible. A fever might sweep through a camp. Only through the band's willingness to share food, carry the injured, and tend the weak could individuals survive. This constant balance between vulnerability and support carved deep pathways in the human brain. Our sense of fairness, of resentment when others cheat, and of gratitude when others share, may have roots in these small circles of survival. There was also a rhythm to life that is almost unimaginable now. Days were framed by the rising and setting of the sun. Nights were long, dark, and filled with the sounds of animals. Around the fire, stories, instructions, and plans would have circulated. We cannot know their exact content, but we can see the consequences in the persistence of oral traditions among later hunter-gatherer societies. Memory was collective, built not with books or screens, but with repetition, song, and ritual. To forget was dangerous. To remember together was power. The mind evolved not just to think, but to think socially, embedding knowledge in the group. It is easy to imagine early humans as constantly struggling, but evidence suggests they may have had more leisure than many agricultural societies that came later. When food was abundant, a day's work of foraging or hunting might leave time for rest, play, or creativity. Children likely grew up in mixed-age groups, cared for not just by parents, but by siblings, aunts, uncles, and grandparents. Anthropologists call this alloparenting, and it is one of the reasons human childhood could stretch so long. A child did not just belong to two parents, but to a whole camp, and that extended safety net left space for the learning of skills, the testing of imagination, and the forging of bonds. Yet survival was precarious. Infant mortality was high, and lifespans were short compared to today, though not as short as sometimes believed. Many adults lived into their 40s or 50s if they survived childhood and accidents. That means elders were present, sharing experience, guiding younger hunters, remembering when the rains had last failed. The presence of grandparents may even have been one of the unique features of our species, allowing knowledge to compound across generations. When we ask what kind of world shaped our minds, the answer is not just about food and shelter. It is about scale. Humans lived in worlds small enough to be knowable. A person might never meet a stranger who could not be tied through kinship or alliance. The group's movements followed the patterns of the land and decisions were made face to face. There were no faceless institutions, no anonymous crowds. Reputation was everything, and trust was currency. That is the brain we carry today, one calibrated for intimacy and immediacy. What is striking is how resilient this brain has proven to be. It survived climate swings during the Pleistocene, from lush interglacial forests to arid ice age steppes. It survived competition with other human species and with formidable predators. It survived by clinging to cooperation, by remembering danger, by investing in the slow and vulnerable process of raising children. And all of that happened long before farming, before writing, before cities. We are left, then, with a haunting question. If our minds were shaped in those caves and camps, among a few dozen familiar faces, how do they function today in a world of billions? Are the anxieties, the restlessness, and the longings that so many of us feel simply echoes of that original environment? Mismatches between the cave that built us and the city that surrounds us now? The evidence suggests so, though we cannot be certain. What we can say is that the human brain is not a blank slate. It is the product of hundreds of thousands of years of trial and error, success and failure, in a very different world from the one we live in today. As scientists, we do not pretend to have every answer. The archaeological record is patchy, and the fossils and tools we study are fragments of much larger stories. But taken together, they paint a picture of lives bound by small groups, shifting landscapes, and the persistent search for safety in caves and fires. That picture may not be complete, but it is enough to remind us that the mind you are using right now was not built for skyscrapers or smartphones. It was built for the cave, and that realization is the foundation for everything that follows. Have you ever noticed how easily your thoughts drift toward the worst outcome? You may replay a mistake again and again, or feel the sting of a small insult far more deeply than you enjoy a compliment. You may worry about losing money more than you celebrate gaining it. This tilt toward fear, caution, and loss is not an accident. It is not even a flaw, though it can feel like one in the modern world. It is the inheritance of a brain built for survival rather than for comfort. And the question that pulls us in here is this: why is the human brain so obsessed with threats and losses? The deep record of our species between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago suggests that caution was not optional. In landscapes filled with predators, poisonous plants, shifting climates, and rival groups, being reckless or inattentive was often fatal. Natural selection favoured those who noticed danger quickly, remembered it vividly, and passed that knowledge on. When we study hunter-gatherer societies and primate relatives, a consistent pattern emerges. Organisms devote more mental space to avoiding harm than to seeking pleasure. It is the evolutionary insurance policy. A missed meal is inconvenient. A missed snake is death. The mechanics of this can be glimpsed in modern neuroscience. Structures like the amygdala, small almond-shaped clusters in the brain, are hyper-responsive to potential threats. They light up at images of angry faces or at sudden movements in the corner of the eye. Experiments show that people remember negative words, frightening images, and losses of money more strongly and for longer than positive ones. This asymmetry is called negativity bias, and it shapes nearly every interaction we have with the world. It is not because our ancestors were pessimists, it is because remembering pain kept them alive. Imagine an early human camp along a riverbank in eastern Africa. The group is foraging, and a child plucks berries from a bush. If one of those berries makes her sick, the lesson spreads fast. The memory of which bush caused illness will last far longer and carry more weight than the memory of which bush gave the sweetest taste. To eat from the wrong bush again could be fatal. In this way, negative experiences gained more staying power in both individual memory and group knowledge. The mind evolved not for balance but for survival, weighting danger with extra importance. This risk aversion also played out in hunting. When groups stalked antelope or larger game, hesitation could mean losing a meal, but rashness could mean a goring from horns or trampling hooves. Evidence from stone tool assemblages suggests that humans developed strategies that balanced caution with opportunity, preferring to strike when conditions reduced danger. Spears and later projectile weapons extended the distance between hunter and prey, lowering the risk of injury. Each innovation was a way of reducing exposure to harm, not just of making food acquisition more efficient. The obsession with threats also shaped social life. Conflict within a band could destabilize cooperation, and exclusion from the group was often a death sentence. The brain therefore evolved to track slights, betrayals, and dangers to reputation. Modern psychology confirms this sensitivity. Gossip spreads faster when it involves cheating or betrayal than when it involves generosity. Early humans needed to remember who could be trusted with food sharing and who had shirked duties. Anger and resentment may have been emotional alarms that preserved fairness in fragile groups. Climate instability added another layer of pressure. The period between 300,000 and 50,000 years ago was marked by repeated swings between warm and cold, wet and dry. Lakes in Africa filled and dried, forests retreated and advanced, grasslands expanded and contracted. For groups dependent on seasonal migration routes, a failed rainy season could mean hunger. To survive such uncertainty required constant vigilance and the ability to anticipate worst-case scenarios. Those who underestimated scarcity did not leave descendants. Those who overestimated risk often survived. The legacy of that is our tendency to over-prepare, to stockpile, and to worry about loss even in abundance. The archaeological record hints at this cautious mentality. At sites like Olorgesailie in Kenya, stone tool deposits show not just casual knapping, but systematic preparation of tools from materials carried over long distances. This suggests foresight, an awareness that situations could turn dangerous, and that readiness was insurance. Carrying a sharp tool might slow you down slightly, but it offered protection against the unknown. In psychological terms, this is the ancient root of anxiety, a readiness system that assumes something could go wrong and prepares for it in advance. Of course, the brain also sought rewards. Pleasure from ripe fruit or successful hunts reinforced useful behaviours. But pleasure alone was unreliable. It faded quickly. Danger imprinted more deeply, because forgetting danger was more costly than forgetting delight. Our ancestors may have enjoyed the sweet pulp of a fig, but they remembered for a lifetime which snakes nested in fig groves. That imbalance is why modern humans can list their failures more easily than their triumphs, and why a single harsh comment outweighs many words of praise. Even sleep was shaped by threat. Studies of contemporary hunter-gatherers show that groups often maintain staggered sleep patterns, with at least one person lightly awake through the night. This watchfulness likely stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. Sleep could not be completely safe, so the brain evolved to remain sensitive to sudden sounds or movements. Nightmares, too, may have served a purpose, rehearsing dangers in a low-cost simulation that prepared the dreamer for real threats. If you wake from a dream of falling or of being chased, you're feeling the echo of an ancient rehearsal system. The fixation on threats also explains much of human storytelling. Around the fires, tales often focused on cautionary themes, spirits in dangerous places, warnings about greedy behaviour, or lessons about disobedience. These are not just cultural accidents, they are mnemonic tools. By embedding dangers in narrative, communities ensured that the next generation would remember. Even myths and legends, though we cannot trace them back with certainty, likely carried the same weight. Keep to the group, avoid the dark, beware the stranger. Stories were survival software. What is remarkable is that this system worked too well. It created humans who could adapt to volatile climates, who could coordinate hunts, who could avoid poisoning, who could manage fragile social networks. But the cost was a brain primed to anticipate loss, tuned to expect betrayal, and constantly scanning for danger. In the modern world, this manifests as anxiety disorders, chronic worry, and stress responses that feel out of proportion. Yet from an evolutionary perspective, they are exactly in proportion. They are the continuation of a brain that never stopped prioritizing survival over peace of mind. We cannot know every detail of how our ancestors thought. The record is fragmentary, and psychology experiments with modern participants are imperfect analogues for the minds of those who lived so long ago. Still, the convergence of archaeology, anthropology, and neuroscience paints a consistent picture. It is not one of rational calculators balancing pleasure and pain evenly. It is one of cautious beings leaning heavily toward the negative, because those who leaned the other way often did not survive to pass on their tendencies. So when you find yourself dwelling on mistakes or fretting about losses, you are not broken. You're using a brain honed in a world of predators, poisons, and precarious survival. It may feel maladaptive today, but for hundreds of thousands of years it was exactly the right tool for the job. And it leaves us with a question that is both sobering and strangely comforting. If the very anxieties that trouble us now are the same ones that saved our ancestors then, can we ever truly expect to live without them? Or are we forever shadowed by the ghosts of dangers long gone, carrying minds built for survival rather than for comfort? Imagine the full sweep of 300,000 years, from the first known populations of Homo sapiens in Africa to the dawn of farming only 10,000 years ago. Across this immense span of time, tools changed, climates shifted, and landscapes opened and closed. But one thing remained strikingly constant: the scale of human groups. You were born into a circle of relatives, companions, and allies that rarely exceeded a few dozen to a few hundred people. That limit shaped not only how our ancestors lived, but how their brains grew to process the world. So we ask the haunting question here: were we only ever designed to really know 150 people? The number comes not from myth, but from comparative anthropology and primatology. In the 1990s, British anthropologist Robin Dunbar noticed a pattern in primates. The size of the neocortex, the outer layer of the brain responsible for social cognition and memory, correlated with the typical size of their social groups. Monkeys with smaller brains lived in smaller groups. Apes with larger brains could maintain larger communities. When Dunbar applied the same calculation to humans, the estimate landed around 150. That, he suggested, was the natural limit of relationships a human mind could track with genuine familiarity. Not acquaintances, not strangers, but people you know well enough to understand their reputations, kinship ties, and trustworthiness. Archaeology and ethnography both suggest that this is roughly accurate for our distant past. Hunter-gatherer groups were often composed of smaller bands of 20 to 40, who came together into larger gatherings of perhaps 100 or more for rituals, exchanges, or cooperative hunts. At these scales, gossip was sufficient to maintain order. You did not need written laws or police forces because everyone knew everyone else. If someone cheated, word spread. If someone excelled, the reputation endured. The entire group functioned on personal accountability, with memory and conversation as the glue. Sites such as Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic, dating to around 30,000 years ago, reveal evidence of large gatherings. Hearths, ornaments, and hunting debris point to communal living that temporarily swelled beyond the size of daily bands. But even then the numbers fall within Dunbar's range. We do not see evidence of sustained populations in the thousands until agriculture made food surpluses possible. For the vast majority of human evolution, your social world was limited enough that you could recognize every voice in the dark. This limitation was not simply a matter of convenience, it was wired into cognition. Remembering who owed you meat, who shared firewood, who quarrelled with whom, demanded neural resources. The human brain seems to have evolved to juggle just enough of these ties to make cooperation scalable without collapsing into chaos. Grooming, so important among primates, was replaced or supplemented by language. Talking about others, what we call gossip, emerged as an efficient way to maintain bonds. Through gossip, information about behaviour spread faster than direct observation alone. Someone might say, he shared his antelope, or she hoarded the nuts. These stories reinforced reputations and allowed the group to cooperate without everyone needing first-hand experience. The cost of maintaining such a network is visible even today. Friendships fade when neglected, because the brain cannot endlessly track dormant ties. In ancestral groups, attention would have been focused tightly on those whose actions affected daily survival. Outsiders could be noticed, even welcomed, but they were not woven into the same dense fabric of obligations. The fact that our brains favour intimacy over anonymity explains why trust still comes more easily face-to-face than across larger impersonal systems. The scale of 150 also helps explain ritual and symbolism in the archaeological record. From ochre markings in Blombos Cave to beads strung into ornaments, these objects may have served as identity markers in gatherings larger than everyday life. When multiple bands converged, visual signals helped track who belonged to which kin group. Language amplified the effect, but objects gave tangible cues. This was an early extension of memory, a way of stretching the brain's capacity without overloading it. There is also the question of conflict. Anthropological studies of hunter-gatherers suggest that disputes often arose within groups and could threaten cohesion. But because the numbers were limited, resolution was possible through discussion, ostracism, or in extreme cases, splitting the group. You could not simply vanish into an anonymous crowd. Everyone knew the story. That constant visibility encouraged caution in behaviour, but it also reinforced bonds of trust. The scale of the group kept accountability sharp. Even kinship systems reflect these limits. Many societies divide relatives into name categories that extend beyond nuclear families. Terms for cousins, uncles, and in-laws provide a mental map that helps track obligations. Within a group of 150, such categories keep relationships manageable. You may not know every detail of how you are related to each person, but you know the category and what duties come with it. This linguistic scaffolding is another tool for stretching social cognition just to the edge of its capacity. We must be careful here not to imagine an exact number carved in stone. The figure of 150 is an average, not a rigid ceiling. Some groups may have managed slightly larger circles, others slightly smaller. Personality, ecology, and technology all shape the possibilities. Still, the broad pattern holds. Our ancestors' minds were tuned not for thousands, but for hundreds. That range defined the scale of intimacy in which trust, cooperation, and shared memory were possible. The importance of this cannot be overstated. It explains why our ancestors could survive in hostile landscapes with minimal technology. They relied on cohesion, on the ability to know and be known. Every member of the group carried knowledge, and that knowledge was distributed through conversation and story. When someone died, their expertise in plants or hunting might be lost, but within a small community others often carried overlapping skills. The web of memory was resilient because it was interwoven. This also highlights why betrayal was so devastating. In a group of 100, one act of deception could echo for years. A thief or a liar was not forgotten, because memory lasted across lifetimes. The sting of betrayal we still feel today may echo those ancient consequences. To be cheated in such a group was not merely a loss of resources, but a breach in the very fabric of survival. When archaeologists look at the spread of early Homo sapiens across Africa, they see evidence of small, scattered populations connected by occasional exchanges of tools, pigments, and ornaments. This web of small groups maintained genetic diversity and cultural innovation without requiring massive cities. The tribe of 150 was both self-sufficient and connected to a larger tapestry of humanity. It was the scale at which intimacy met innovation. So what does this tell us about ourselves? It tells us that the brain you are using to listen to these words was sculpted in a world where everyone you knew could fit into a single clearing, a single gathering by a riverbank, a single network of shared meals. It tells us that our comfort with gossip, our need for belonging, and our sensitivity to reputation are not quirks but adaptations. They are echoes of a scale of life that endured for hundreds of millennia. And it leaves us with a lingering question. If we were shaped to know only 150, what happens when we live among millions? How does a mind built for face-to-face gossip navigate a world of strangers, institutions, and vast societies? The answer to that lies ahead, but for now we must remember, the tribe of 150 is not just a number. It is the imprint of deep time, a reminder that the scale of our minds does not always match the scale of our world. When we look at the fossil record, it is tempting to search for the one feature that made us human. For more than a century, scientists have pointed to the skull, measuring brain volume and comparing cranial capacities across ancient lineages. Bigger brain, smarter human, better survivor. It seems like an obvious equation, but what if that is not the whole story? What if our intelligence was not the cause of our survival, but the side effect of something more subtle? The question that matters here is this. What if our intelligence was only a side effect of being cooperative? Between 200,000 and 50,000 years ago, Homo sapiens were far from the only human form. Neanderthals lived across Europe and Western Asia. Denisovans occupied unknown stretches of Eurasia. Earlier forms of Homo still lingered in parts of Africa and Asia. Many of these groups had brain sizes comparable to ours, some even larger on average. If survival was only a contest of brain volume, the outcome should not have been so one-sided. Yet, over time, we are the only ones left. That forces us to ask whether something else was at play. Evidence suggests that the strength of Homo sapiens lay not in raw intellect, but in social cohesion. We were, quite simply, the friendlier ape. Fossil and archaeological traces show that groups of our ancestors lived in ways that required intricate collaboration. Big game hunting was almost impossible alone. Gathering diverse plant foods required a shared mental map of the landscape. Long childhoods demanded care from parents, siblings, and elders. And when groups met, they often exchanged materials, pigments, and tools in networks that stretched beyond daily encounters. All of this points to an extraordinary reliance on cooperation. The theory of self-domestication adds weight to this idea. Over thousands of generations, humans may have selected not just for strength or cleverness, but for reduced aggression and increased sociability. Comparisons with other primates highlight the pattern. Bonobos, often called the peaceful cousins of chimpanzees, show how tolerance and play can sustain large, flexible groups. Some researchers argue that humans took this further, pruning away the most violent tendencies through social punishment, ostracism, and preference for cooperative partners. Over time, this may have tilted the balance toward individuals who could get along, share, and plan together. Intelligence, language, and culture flourished on that foundation. Archaeological finds support the cooperative thesis. At sites such as Pinnacle Point in South Africa, dating to more than 100,000 years ago, we find evidence of shellfish harvesting, pigment use, and complex stone tools. These activities imply not just technical skill, but shared knowledge and division of labour. Harvesting shellfish requires coordination with tides and group scheduling. Pigments may have played roles in signalling identity across bands. Tools with standardised shapes suggest teaching and imitation. None of these flourish in isolation. They require communities that value sharing and transmitting skills. The emergence of language itself may have been less about abstract thought and more about managing social complexity. Gossip and storytelling allowed information about cooperation, generosity, or betrayal to spread. Once vocal communication could carry reputations beyond direct observation, cooperation became even more powerful. Language allowed groups to grow in size, to sustain trust across distance, and to pass knowledge across generations. The richness of our minds may therefore be the scaffolding that emerged to support our uniquely cooperative lives. Even genetic evidence hints at this path. Comparisons between humans and other primates show differences in regions linked to social cognition, empathy, and facial recognition. These are not the hallmarks of solitary hunters, but of species whose survival depends on reading others. Emotional intelligence, the ability to interpret subtle cues in faces and voices, may have been as critical to survival as physical strength. A person who could anticipate another's needs, soothe tensions, or rally a group might leave more descendants than the strongest fighter. We should be cautious here. It is difficult to reconstruct the mental lives of people who lived hundreds of thousands of years ago. Fossils cannot tell us whether someone was cooperative or selfish. But when we piece together the indirect evidence, long childhoods, shared child-rearing, networks of exchange, collective hunting strategies and cultural traditions, the pattern points consistently to a species that leaned heavily on cooperation. Intelligence was not the spark that created cooperation. Cooperation was the crucible that forged intelligence. There is also the paradox of brain size. Neanderthals had brains as large as or larger than ours, yet their archaeological record shows less evidence of long-distance exchange networks and less evidence of symbolic traditions. They survived in small groups but may have lacked the same scale of cooperative connectivity. This does not mean they were less intelligent in daily life, but it does suggest that Homo sapiens were more deeply invested in creating webs of interdependence. The advantage was not that we thought more clearly alone, but that we thought better together. Consider the problem of survival during droughts. When rains failed, groups could starve unless they had allies in distant territories willing to share resources. Archaeological evidence of obsidian and shell movement across hundreds of kilometers shows that Homo sapiens maintained such networks. This kind of cooperation requires trust beyond immediate kin, reinforced by symbols, rituals, and mutual obligations. It is in such spaces that our intelligence blossomed, not as a solitary calculation, but as a collective achievement. The fossil record of skeletal injuries adds another layer. Many ancient skeletons show evidence of serious trauma that healed. This means the injured survived long enough to recover, which would have been impossible without group support. In other words, people who could not hunt or gather were cared for. Such investment in vulnerable individuals is rare in the animal kingdom. It demonstrates a cooperative ethic so strong that it redefined the rules of survival. From this perspective, even our weaknesses make sense. Human infants are astonishingly helpless compared to other primates, requiring years of care. That vulnerability forced communities to deepen cooperation, which in turn favoured those best at nurturing and planning. Large brains may have been partly a response to the demands of raising and socialising children in such complex webs of care. Intelligence was not an isolated trait, but an emergent property of extended childhood and cooperative networks. The story is humbling. Our species did not conquer the world through solitary genius. We were not the strongest, not necessarily the quickest, and not uniquely endowed with the largest brains. We became what we are by becoming the most cooperative. Our intelligence is less the crown of evolution than the byproduct of a long process of learning to live together. The friendly ape is not a flattering slogan, but it may be the most accurate one. And this leaves us with a question that lingers uncomfortably. If our intelligence grew out of cooperation, what happens when cooperation frays? What happens when groups fracture, when trust erodes, when the bonds of empathy weaken? Are we still the friendly ape? Or are we living in ways that strain the very foundation of what made us human? The evidence of prehistory cannot answer this fully, but it reminds us that our minds are not just thinking machines. They are social engines, built to thrive when we work together, and falter when we turn apart. Picture the Earth between 300,000 and 30,000 years ago. The map of humanity then would not show one species dominating every continent. but a patchwork of different humans spread across landscapes from Africa to Europe to Asia. They were not science fiction creatures or mythical beings, but real populations of flesh and bone who walked, hunted, and raised children just as we did. For most of our evolutionary story, Homo sapiens were not alone. The unsettling question is this: why are we the only humans left? The evidence of this world comes slowly, piece by piece, from caves, riverbanks, and mountain valleys. In Africa, our own species had already taken root by 300,000 years ago, as shown by fossils from Jebel Irhoud in Morocco. These early sapiens had faces and brains recognisably close to ours, though not identical, and they lived alongside other hominins whose bones are now difficult to classify. Meanwhile, in Europe and Western Asia, Neanderthals thrived. They were shorter, more robust, with elongated skulls and heavy brow ridges, but they made stone tools of great sophistication, hunted large animals, and survived in icy climates for hundreds of thousands of years. Farther east, in the mountains of Siberia, a different lineage left only a finger bone and a tooth in Denisova cave. From such sparse remains, we now know that Denisovans were a distinct kind of human, adapted perhaps to high altitudes and cold environments. They are ghostly in the record, yet their existence tells us the human story was even more crowded than we once believed. And in the islands of Indonesia, the so-called hobbits of Flores lived until at least 50,000 years ago. Homo floresiensis stood barely over a metre tall, with brains no bigger than those of chimpanzees, but they crafted tools, used fire, and survived among giant storks and dwarf elephants. Each of these species was human in the sense that they walked upright, made tools, cared for their young, and altered their surroundings. But each was different enough to be recognised as distinct, with its own evolutionary history. Neanderthals diverged from our lineage more than 400,000 years ago. Denisovans split off from the same branch, but went their own way in the east. Flores people likely descended from much earlier migrants who became isolated and shrank in size over time. For hundreds of millennia, the planet was shared by this array of humans, each adapting to its environment, each solving the problem of survival in its own way. What is remarkable is that for most of our history, this diversity was not seen as extraordinary. It was the norm. The last 20,000 years, during which only one human species has walked the Earth, are the anomaly. Before that, coexistence was reality. Fossil sites show overlapping time frames. Around 100,000 years ago, Neanderthals occupied parts of Europe. Denisovans lingered in Asia, Flores people lived in Indonesia, and Homo sapiens thrived in Africa. The world was a mosaic of humans. Archaeological traces reveal that these groups were not primitive in the dismissive sense once imagined. Neanderthals used birch tar as an adhesive, evidence of complex chemistry. They made ornaments and may have buried their dead. Denisovans left a little material culture, but the very survival of their lineage for so long in challenging environments speaks to ingenuity. Flores people, though tiny, managed fire and stone tools in an island ecosystem with formidable predators. Intelligence came in many shapes, and no single lineage had a monopoly on creativity. The coexistence of these humans raises profound questions about interaction. Did they meet peacefully, exchanging goods or mates? Did they compete violently for territory and resources? Archaeology gives hints but rarely certainty. At some sites, tool traditions overlap in ways that suggest contact. At others, layers alternate, implying replacement. We know only that for tens of thousands of years, different kinds of humans encountered one another, sometimes in caves, sometimes on open plains. The fact that fossils of different species appear in close proximity means these meetings must have been part of life. It is tempting to frame this as a contest, with sapiens triumphing through superior intelligence, but that explanation oversimplifies the evidence. Neanderthals endured the cold steppes of Ice Age Europe for longer than Homo sapiens have existed. Denisovans persisted in Asia in ways we still do not understand. Flores people carved out a niche on their island against improbable odds. Each of these groups was successful in its own right. The disappearance of all but one may not have been inevitable, but the product of complex factors, climate swings, demographic accidents, disease, and yes, perhaps competition with our ancestors. One striking feature of sapiens is range. Fossils and artifacts show our species spreading across Africa, into the Levant, and later into Asia and Europe. Our populations may have been more interconnected, maintaining broader exchange networks. This web of contacts could have provided resilience, allowing cultural innovations to spread faster and groups to rebound from local disasters. Other humans may have been more localized, more specialized in their adaptations, and thus more vulnerable when climates changed or new groups arrived. Still, we should resist the temptation to write the story as one of inevitable replacement. The truth is that we do not fully know why these other humans vanished. Climate shifts around 40,000 years ago were severe, altering habitats across continents. The arrival of sapiens into Europe coincides with the disappearance of Neanderthals. But whether through direct conflict, gradual absorption, or ecological pressure, the details remain uncertain. Denisovans vanish from the record with even less clarity. Flores people disappear around the same time, perhaps overwhelmed by volcanic activity or by incoming sapiens. Each extinction is a puzzle with missing pieces. What we can say with confidence is that the world of many humans was real. For hundreds of thousands of years, our ancestors were not unique in their humanity. They lived alongside cousins who walked differently, looked differently, and yet lived fully human lives. To stand in a valley then might have meant meeting a group whose language was incomprehensible, whose faces were unfamiliar, but whose eyes looked back with the same awareness. Reflecting on this diversity reshapes how we think of ourselves. We are not the pinnacle of a steady climb, but the last survivors of a tangled bush of lineages. The disappearance of the others leaves us with a strange inheritance, a world where being human feels singular, though it was once plural. This singularity is fragile. Had history broken differently, we might today share the planet with other kinds of humans, each with its own culture and perspective. The haunting question remains, why us? Why only us? The evidence so far cannot give a single, final answer. Perhaps cooperation gave sapiens resilience. Perhaps sheer numbers tipped the scales. Perhaps chance disasters cut down populations already stretched thin. What we do know is that by 30,000 years ago, the world that had once been full of humans was left with only one. The memory of the others lingers in bones and tools and caves and islands, silent reminders that our species is not inevitable but contingent. The world of many humans was their world as much as ours, and their absence is part of what defines us today. When we compare ourselves to the other humans who once shared the planet, we do not look like the obvious winners. Neanderthals had sturdy frames and powerful bodies built for survival in cold climates. Denisovans, though little is known, appear to have thrived in challenging high-altitude environments. Homo floresiensis carved out a niche on a remote island with extraordinary ingenuity despite their tiny size. By contrast, early Homo sapiens were lean, less robust, and seemingly less specialized. So how did the least likely human survive? Between 200,000 and 20,000 years ago, our species faced repeated trials. Fossil evidence shows that early sapiens populations were small and often confined to specific refuges within Africa. Climatic swings threatened to fragment habitats, with deserts expanding during dry periods and forests retracting. Archaeological layers suggest population bottlenecks, times when our numbers may have dwindled dangerously. To an outside observer, then, it might have looked as if we were the underdogs, clinging to survival while stronger or better adapted humans held their ground elsewhere. What set sapiens apart was not physical dominance but flexibility. Our skeletons show that we were built for endurance rather than brute strength. Long legs and narrow hips favoured persistence hunting, chasing prey over long distances until exhaustion brought it down. This was not the strategy of a heavyweight fighter, but of a patient opportunist. Our bodies also tolerated a wide range of diets, from gathered plants to scavenged meat to coastal shellfish. Sites like Pinnacle Point in South Africa reveal that by 160,000 years ago, sapiens were exploiting marine resources, an unusual adaptation among humans of the time. That kind of dietary breadth gave us options when environments changed. Flexibility extended beyond food. Tool traditions in Africa show remarkable variety and innovation. Stone blades, microliths, and projectile points appear in different regions, suggesting experimentation and adaptation to local conditions. Unlike the more uniform tools associated with some other human species, sapiens seem to have embraced diversity. This constant tinkering may have been a survival strategy, allowing small groups to adjust to shifting climates and resources rather than relying on a single mode of life. Social networks further reinforced resilience. Evidence of long-distance movement of materials, such as obsidian or shells, points to connections beyond immediate groups. These networks could have served as lifelines during hard times, enabling the exchange of food, mates, and ideas. Small populations could easily vanish in isolation, but networks provided buffers. If one region suffered drought, alliances in another might offer refuge. This web of relationships, fragile but real, helped sustain sapiens through periods when extinction seemed a genuine risk. Even the apparent weaknesses of our species may have become strengths. Our infants were exceptionally helpless compared to other primates, demanding years of care. This vulnerability forced deeper cooperation within groups, reinforcing bonds of trust and shared responsibility. Grandparents, siblings, and extended kin all played roles in raising children. This broadened circle of caregiving may have strengthened social cohesion, ensuring that knowledge and skills were distributed widely rather than concentrated in a few individuals. In such systems, the loss of one person did not erase entire bodies of knowledge. Adaptability also applied to habitats. Fossil and artifact sites show sapiens inhabiting grasslands, forests, coasts, and eventually even deserts and highlands. By 80,000 years ago, groups were already exploring routes out of Africa into the Levant. Though many of these early migrations failed or retracted, they show a willingness to move and test new environments. Over time, this exploratory impulse gave us an advantage, allowing expansion into diverse niches that other humans may not have attempted or sustained. It is important to acknowledge how precarious this journey was. Genetic studies suggest that populations of Homo sapiens went through narrow bottlenecks, times when only a small fraction of individuals carried the species forward. Survival was not assured. Extinction was possible. That we are here at all is a reminder of how close we came to vanishing like the others. What explains the eventual persistence of sapiens while others disappeared remains uncertain. Climate shifts likely played a role, stressing isolated populations. Small numbers make any species vulnerable to chance disasters. Our wider networks and adaptability may have tipped the balance, allowing us to rebound from crises where others could not. But it was never inevitable. To imagine Homo sapiens as destined for dominance is to misread the fragile contingencies of prehistory. We were the underdogs, and we survived as much through luck and circumstance as through any inherent superiority. Archaeological evidence reinforces this humility. Sites in Africa show repeated patterns of innovation followed by abandonment. Technologies appear, flourish briefly, and then disappear, suggesting that groups often struggle to maintain continuity. This stop-start pattern is not the story of a triumphant march toward progress, but of small, vulnerable bands experimenting in fits and starts. Survival depended on persistence, not perfection. We must also consider the role of cooperation beyond kin. While Neanderthals and other humans surely cooperated, the archaeological hints of long-distance exchange among sapiens suggest a distinctive emphasis on building ties with strangers. This willingness to extend trust beyond immediate family may have been risky, but it broadened the safety net. It also laid the groundwork for cultural complexity, allowing ideas to spread and recombine across regions. So how did the least likely human survive? By being flexible where others specialized, by building networks where others remained local, by enduring scarcity with patience rather than brute force, by investing in vulnerable children and elders rather than abandoning them. None of these traits alone guaranteed survival, but together they formed a pattern of resilience. And this leaves us with a haunting reflection. If we survived not because we were the strongest or the smartest, but because we were the most adaptable and cooperative, what does that say about our future? Are we still that underdog species finding resilience in diversity and connection? Or have we forgotten the very traits that once carried us through the razor's edge of extinction? The record of prehistory cannot answer for us, but it whispers a reminder: survival is not destiny. It is earned, fragile, and never guaranteed. Somewhere around 12,000 years ago, small groups of hunter-gatherers made a choice, or perhaps stumbled into one. that would reshape the fate of our species. They began to sow seeds and tether animals. For the first time, people tried to make food grow where they wanted it, rather than chase it where it wandered. It feels like the obvious beginning of civilization, the moment of invention that led to cities, writing, states, and everything we recognize as history. But the question we cannot avoid is this: was farming our greatest invention, or was it our greatest trap? The backdrop to this leap was the end of the last ice age. As glaciers retreated and climates warmed between 12,000 and 8,000 BCE, new landscapes opened across the Near East, East Asia, Mesoamerica, and beyond. Wild cereals such as wheat and barley grew in abundance in the Fertile Crescent. Herds of gazelle, sheep, and goats roamed valleys and hillsides. People who had long lived by foraging began to experiment with tending these resources more deliberately. Archaeological sites like Jericho in the Levant and Çatalhöyük in Anatolia preserved traces of those first settled communities, their floors packed with grain husks and their walls adorned with images of animals. At first, farming may not have looked revolutionary. It was a supplement, not a replacement. Groups still foraged, but they also planted seeds near camps and encouraged wild herds to linger. Over generations, these experiments became commitments. Wild plants were reshaped into domestic crops. Goats and sheep were penned and selectively bred. The shift was gradual, stretching across centuries, but by 8000 BCE, entire communities relied primarily on cultivated fields and herded animals. The apparent benefits were clear. Farming could feed more people on the same land. Surpluses could be stored for lean seasons. Populations grew and permanent villages emerged. Yet beneath this surface of progress lay costs that would echo through millennia. Skeletons from early farming communities reveal a paradox. Instead of robust health, many show signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, and disease. Diets narrowed to cereals and domesticated meat, lacking the variety of wild foods. Grinding grain wore down teeth. Crowded settlements exposed people to waste, parasites, and epidemics. Where hunter-gatherers often enjoyed a broad diet and mobility, farmers endured monotonous food and the risks of staying put. Inequality also took root. Stored surpluses allowed some to accumulate wealth and power. Houses in Çatalhöyük vary in size, suggesting differences in status. Burials with ornaments and goods point to emerging hierarchies. Farming created the possibility of plenty, but it also created the possibility of hoarding. For the first time, humans could be rich or poor not just in skill or reputation, but in material possessions. Hierarchies hardened into structures that would later become states and empires. Violence changed in scale as well. Hunter-gatherer conflicts could be deadly, but they were limited by small group sizes. Farming villages with stored grain and crowded populations presented tempting targets. Fortifications appear in the archaeological record. Skeletal remains show injuries consistent with raids and battles. Farming did not necessarily invent violence, but it amplified its scale and stakes. To defend crops and territory became a new constant of human life. Disease is another part of the story. Crowded settlements provided fertile ground for pathogens. Domesticated animals carried parasites and viruses that could jump into human populations. Archaeologists and geneticists now trace the origins of many diseases, tuberculosis, measles, influenza, to these early interactions between humans and animals. The intimacy of village life, with livestock in courtyards and grain stored in granaries, brought new risks that no hunter-gatherer had faced. Still, the farming revolution spread. From the Fertile Crescent it radiated eastward into South Asia, westward into Europe, and eventually across the globe. Independent centres of domestication also emerged. Rice in China, maize in the Americas, yams in West Africa. Everywhere the pattern was similar. Foragers experimented, domesticated, settled, and grew. Everywhere health and equality often declined even as populations rose. Farming allowed more mouths to be fed, but not always well. The trap of farming was subtle. Once a community committed to crops, retreat was difficult. Populations grew beyond what foraging alone could support. Abandoning fields would mean starvation. Communities locked themselves into cycles of planting, harvesting, and defending stores. The flexibility that had once been sapiens' greatest strength narrowed into seasonal routines. Success bred dependency, and yet, from this dependency sprang much of what we associate with civilization. Surpluses supported specialists who could build monuments, craft art, and develop technologies. Villages expanded into towns, towns into cities. Written records first appear to track grain rations and taxes. The very foundations of history, archives, laws, and states, rest on agriculture. The trap carried its own rewards, dazzling enough to obscure the costs. The bones of early farmers still whisper the truth. Compared to their foraging ancestors, they were often shorter, less robust, and plagued by ailments. Their lives may have been harder in many respects, but they were more numerous. Evolutionarily, numbers matter. Farming succeeded not because it made life easier, but because it made life reproducible at larger scales. Populations could expand, and with expansion came permanence. As we look back, we must resist the temptation to declare farming either triumph or disaster. It was both. It gave rise to art cities and states, but it also introduced inequality, disease, and new forms of violence. It turned humans from wanderers into settlers, from opportunists into labourers. It was a leap too big to reverse. Once made, it defined the trajectory of our species. And so we are left with the haunting question: did we choose farming, or did farming choose us? Was it invention or entrapment? The evidence does not give us certainty. What we can say is that the leap between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago was the most consequential turn in human history. It set us on the path to the crowded, complex, conflicted world we inhabit today. And it began, simply enough, with seeds scattered into soil and animals tethered by rope. Imagine walking into a settlement of mud brick houses 8,000 years ago. Walls pressed tight against one another, roofs serving as streets, smoke rising from hearths that burned day and night. Imagine the smell of grain stores, animals penned within enclosures, and neighbours whose names you might not know even though their homes touch your own. For a mind that had spent hundreds of thousands of years in small, intimate groups, this new way of living must have been overwhelming. The question presses in: what happens when cave people brains move into cities? The roots of this transformation can be traced to the Neolithic, after the spread of farming had reshaped landscapes. Villages like Jericho in the Jordan Valley grew from clusters of houses into fortified settlements by around 8000 BCE. Archaeologists have uncovered massive stone towers and walls there, evidence that people were already defending stores of grain and perhaps themselves against raids. Çatalhöyük in Anatolia, occupied from about 7000 BCE, presents another vision: dense housing blocks without streets, with people entering homes through rooftop ladders. These were not sprawling metropolises by modern standards, but they were orders of magnitude larger than the foraging camps of our ancestors. For the first time, thousands of individuals could be found living together in one place. What did this mean for the human mind? In small bands, trust and reputation were maintained by direct knowledge. In these early cities, anonymity began to creep in. Not every face could be familiar. Not every interaction could be tracked through gossip alone. This shift demanded new tools, rituals, symbols, and eventually institutions to regulate behaviour. Temples rose in settlements like Eridu and Uruk, not just as religious centres, but as places of storage, redistribution, and authority. The gods may have provided the story, but the real function was social glue. Archaeological remains tell a story of stress as well as innovation. Skeletons from early urban centres often show higher rates of disease, injury and malnutrition compared to rural populations. Crowding increased exposure to pathogens, and diets dependent on cereals remained limited. Workloads intensified with irrigation and construction. The promise of abundance came with the price of labour and illness, and yet the system persisted because it supported populations larger than any previous human experiment. The stress of urban life is not something we can measure directly in bones, but indirect evidence abounds. Fortifications speak of conflict. Burial differences suggest inequality. The distribution of luxury goods reveals networks of trade and status. These patterns reflect a world in which strangers live side by side, competition for resources sharpened, and hierarchies crystallized. For a brain evolved for intimacy, This was a bewildering new environment. Cortisol, the hormone that surges under stress, would have been familiar to ancient farmers as they faced crop failure, but in cities it may have become a constant presence, triggered by noise, crowding, and insecurity. Still, cities unleashed creativity. Uruk in Mesopotamia, by around 3000 BCE, had tens of thousands of residents. There, clay tablets preserved the first writing, born from the need to track grain, debts, and labour. The wheel and the plough appear in the same period, technologies that reshaped transport and agriculture. Monumental architecture, ziggurats, temples, palaces, testified to collective effort and authority. None of this would have been possible without the dense networks of urban life. The paradox is clear. Cities solved the problem of feeding and organising large populations, but they also magnified the very pressures our brains were not designed to handle. The shift from knowing every member of a band to living among thousands of strangers was not gradual in cognitive terms. Our neural circuits remained tuned to intimacy, even as our social worlds demanded abstraction. Trust moved from faces to tokens, from personal bonds to symbols like seals, coins, and contracts. Law codes emerged to substitute for the judgment of elders. Even art reflects this tension. The walls of Çatalhöyük are covered with images of animals, hunts, and sometimes abstract shapes. In Mesopotamia, cylinder seals depicted scenes of ritual and authority. These were not only decorations, but systems of meaning, reminders of shared identities that could unite strangers. Symbols carried the burden of cohesion when memory could no longer do the work alone. We should be humble in drawing conclusions. The archaeological record gives us fragments, bones, walls, shards of pottery, and we interpret them through the lens of modern science. But the broad outline is clear. The city experiment transformed human life. It brought scale and innovation, but also stress and inequality. The very success of cities in sustaining large populations ensured their survival, even as individuals paid the cost in health and stability. So what happens when cave people brains move into cities? They adapt imperfectly. They invent gods, laws, and markets to manage strangers. They endure new diseases and hierarchies. They find ways to live with noise and crowding, even as stress shadows them. And yet they also create art, writing, and monumental architecture. The experiment was not comfortable, but it was enduring. By 2000 BCE, urban centres dotted Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, Egypt, and China. The age of the village was giving way to the age of the city. The haunting question remains: did cities free us or trap us? Were they the ultimate achievement of human ingenuity, or the environment most alien to the minds that built them? The evidence suggests both. Our brains did not evolve for cities, but cities became the crucibles of our history. We are still living with the consequences of that leap, still asking whether we are better for it or merely more numerous. What makes the first cities so compelling is not only their scale, but their fragility. Archaeologists studying the earliest urban layers in places like Uruk and Mohenjo-Daro find abrupt abandonments, signs of flooding, fires, or social collapse. These settlements were experiments, and like all experiments, many failed. Populations rose quickly when harvests were good and trade was strong, but when rivers shifted course or drought struck, cities emptied. The experiment of urban life was never guaranteed. What endured was not a single city but the model itself, the idea that thousands could be gathered, organised and sustained in one place, however precariously. Living in these early cities meant entering a world where one's sense of belonging shifted. A forager's identity had been rooted in kin and camp. An urban dweller's identity was tied to neighbourhoods, temples, and eventually states. New hierarchies arose, with elites who claimed authority through divine sanction or control of surplus. Common labourers built walls and monuments they did not own. The shift from equality to stratification left its marks in graves, where some were buried with rich goods and others with nothing. The city, for all its wonders, hardened lines between people, and yet, for all their faults, cities created something profoundly new: continuity. Knowledge recorded on clay tablets could outlast memory. Ritual calendars synchronized thousands of people across seasons. Streets, walls, and monuments gave a sense of permanence that no forager's camp could provide. The city became not just a place to live, but a vessel to carry culture forward. That durability, even when individual cities fell, ensured that urban life as a concept survived. When we look back at those mud brick walls and crowded courtyards, we see both the promise and the strain of the city experiment. We see cave people minds stretched beyond their evolutionary comfort zone, improvising rituals, institutions and symbols to cope with life among strangers. And we see the seeds of our modern world, fragile, stressful, unequal, yet enduring. Walk through the ruins of Babylon, the streets of Rome, or the crowded alleys of medieval London, and you see the ambition of our species to build higher, denser and more permanent than ever before. Mud brick gave way to stone, and stone gave way to timber and concrete. By 2000 BCE, people were already raising towers, walls and temples that dwarfed anything their foraging ancestors had known. By the early modern era of the 1700s, the outlines of the modern city, crowded streets, markets, fortifications and palaces, were everywhere. And yet for all these achievements, the bodies that carried us into these environments were still the same bodies shaped on the savannas of Africa. The question presses in: why do our bodies fail in the very worlds we build? The mismatch between ancient biology and urban invention reveals itself most clearly in health. For tens of millennia, our ancestors lived as mobile foragers, walking long distances daily, squatting, climbing, carrying. Their diets were diverse, rich in fibrous plants, lean meat, and seasonal variety. When cities took hold, the pattern shifted dramatically. Diets narrowed to staple grains such as wheat, rice, and maize. These crops could be stored and taxed, making them ideal for supporting large populations and states, but the cost was nutritional imbalance. Skeletal remains from classical Greece, Rome, and medieval Europe reveal stunted growth, anemia, and dental decay. The very success of agriculture and urban density bred malnutrition. As trade and affluence expanded, another paradox appeared: excess. Elite classes who could afford sugar, refined flour, and meat in abundance began to suffer from what we now call mismatch diseases. Ancient texts describe gout, a painful joint condition linked to rich diets. Obesity appears in art and in burial remains of elites. Diabetes was not named until much later, but conditions resembling it are recorded by physicians in classical antiquity. Our bodies, tuned for scarcity and for constant movement, faltered when exposed to surplus and sedentary living. The strain was not only metabolic. Skeletal evidence from across the last 4,000 years shows a steady rise in spinal deformities, osteoarthritis, and degenerative joint disease. These were the consequences of new labour patterns: stooping in fields, grinding grain for hours, carrying heavy loads in markets and construction sites. The hunter-gatherer body, designed for varied motion and endurance, was pressed into repetitive agricultural and urban labour. The result was chronic pain and wear, conditions still familiar today in the form of back pain, joint problems, and postural strain. Infections also thrived in cities. Pathogens that could not sustain themselves in small mobile groups became endemic in large, dense populations. Tuberculosis, leprosy, and plague left their marks on bones and in historical records. Waste disposal lagged behind population growth, and water sources were easily contaminated. Hunter-gatherers had faced injuries, predators, and occasional epidemics, but urban dwellers endured constant exposure to disease environments for which their immune systems had not been designed. Stress must also have been profound. In small bands, conflict and competition could be managed face to face. In cities of thousands, the noise, crowding, and anonymity would have activated stress responses built for short bursts of danger. Cortisol, the hormone of vigilance, became a chronic companion. Archaeological evidence for stress is indirect, but patterns of skeletal lesions, enamel defects in teeth, and written records of sleeplessness and anxiety suggest that urban life carried emotional as well as physical tolls. Our brains, tuned for the tribe of 150, were now negotiating marketplaces of strangers and hierarchies of kings. The mismatch is clearest when we compare mobility. A forager might have walked 10 to 15 kilometres each day, gathering, hunting, and visiting neighbouring camps. City dwellers often spent long hours seated at looms, crouched in workshops or standing in stalls. Bones adapt to activity, and studies of skeletal robustness show a decline in limb strength across the urban centuries. The skyscrapers of today have their ancestors in the ziggurats of Mesopotamia and the cathedrals of medieval Europe, but through it all our bodies remain tuned for movement in open landscapes, not confinement in vertical stone. It is important to resist the temptation of nostalgia. Life in foraging bands was no paradise. Infant mortality was high, accidents were common, and famine was a recurring threat. But when we examine the health costs of urban life, we see that progress came with hidden burdens. The body that had once thrived on mobility, variety, and intimacy was pressed into immobility, monotony, and crowding. Our achievements in architecture and statecraft did not erase our evolutionary inheritance. The evidence is humbling. We did not redesign ourselves as we built cities. We carried Stone Age bodies into environments they had never been shaped to endure. The consequences: malnutrition, mismatched diseases, spinal pain, infectious epidemics, became the background of civilization. And they raise the haunting question: can we ever build a world that truly fits the bodies and minds we inherited? Or will the story of our species always be one of mismatch, of cave people brains and Stone Age bodies struggling to live in skyscrapers? What deepens this mismatched story is how unevenly it played out across different societies and classes. The bones of wealthy elites in ancient Egypt and Rome, for instance, reveal patterns of overnutrition, gout, obesity, and calcified arteries. Meanwhile, the bones of labourers from the same periods tell the opposite tale: stunted growth from childhood malnutrition, dental decay from cereal-heavy diets, and joint damage from grueling work. The same city walls that brought thousands together also created divides between those with too much and those with too little. But both ends of the spectrum suffered consequences their ancestors would hardly recognise. Textual records add a human voice to these skeletal traces. Babylonian tablets describe healers treating symptoms that sound remarkably like diabetes. Ancient Chinese medical texts discuss ailments linked to sedentary habits and overeating. Hippocrates himself cautioned against the health dangers of luxury and idleness, framing disease as the predictable outcome of lifestyles far removed from the mobile, balanced existence of earlier humans. Again and again, physicians across civilizations noticed that prosperity seemed to carry its own diseases, ones that did not plague their poorer or more rural neighbours. Archaeology also reveals how cities magnified vulnerability to famine. While farming provided surpluses, it also locked populations into dependence on a narrow set of crops. A drought that killed wild grasses for foragers might be survived by moving elsewhere, but for urban farmers tied to fields it could mean starvation. Skeletons from periods of crop failure show unmistakable markers of hunger. Porous bones from anemia, slowed growth in children, and enamel defects in teeth from interrupted development. In this sense, the skyscrapers of our imagination stand on fragile foundations of grain. Bodies always one failed harvest away from collapse. And yet, despite these stresses, people return to the city generation after generation. Why? Because the trade-offs offered something precious: continuity, innovation, protection in numbers. Even if bodies ached and illnesses spread, the collective achievements of city life, writing, law, art, architecture, were undeniable. Humans proved willing to endure pain, imbalance, and disease for the promise of permanence and the security of belonging to something larger than a band of foragers. This is the paradox that lingers in our story. The body that falters in the shadow of monuments is the same one that built them. The mismatches were already visible by the time Hammurabi carved his laws, and the Colosseum echoed with crowds. And the haunting question remains: if Stone Age bodies struggle to adapt to ziggurats and temples, how much more will they struggle in the towers of steel and glass that were still to come? It is a familiar scene. You're home at night, the lights are out, and you suddenly hear a sound in the corner of the room. Logic tells you it is nothing. A settling floorboard, a cat outside, the wind against a window, yet your heart races. Even in a world lit by electricity, we still flinch at shadows. Why do modern humans with street lamps and LED bulbs still fear the dark? To understand this, we must travel back through the long expanse of prehistory. For more than 200,000 years, humans lived without artificial light beyond fire. Night meant vulnerability. Our eyes are poorly adapted for low light, and without vision we lose our primary sense of control. Predators, from lions to leopards to hyenas, often hunted under the cover of darkness. Archaeological evidence of cut-marked bones from sites across Africa shows that early humans were both hunters and prey. Fire provided some protection, but it was never absolute. In this context, fear of the dark was not irrational. It was survival. Our ancestors' nights were filled with risks beyond predators. Snakes, scorpions, and insects were more easily encountered in dim conditions. Venomous bites could kill or maim, and night blindness made avoiding them difficult. Even the terrain itself was dangerous. A misstep in the dark could mean a fall into a ravine or a twisted ankle that spelled disaster for a forager. For hundreds of millennia, darkness was associated with heightened vulnerability. Those who felt unease at night, who erred on the side of caution, survived. Those who ignored the shadows often did not. This evolutionary inheritance still pulses through our nervous system. Studies show that modern humans, even when raised in safe environments, display heightened physiological arousal in darkness. Heart rate increases, startle responses sharpen, and attentional focus narrows. Common phobias, of the dark, of enclosed spaces, of snakes and spiders, appear across cultures, suggesting deep evolutionary roots. These fears are not learned entirely from experience. They are prepared fears, biases etched into the architecture of the brain. Neuroscience helps explain how these ancient patterns persist. The amygdala, the brain region central to fear processing, responds rapidly to ambiguous stimuli, especially in low light. A shadow or sudden movement can trigger alarm before the conscious mind interprets it. This rapid response may once have saved lives by buying precious seconds against predators. Today, it can make a creaking pipe feel like an intruder. The brain's design favours false alarms over missed threats. In ancestral environments, that asymmetry made sense. Archaeological hints remind us how central darkness was to daily life. Hearths in caves show evidence of constant maintenance, suggesting fires were tended through the night. Portable torches, charred sticks found in caves, indicate attempts to push back the darkness even beyond campfires. Myths and rituals from later societies often divide the world into light and dark, order and chaos, safety and danger. These cultural expressions may echo the primal fact that night was always a time to be endured rather than embraced. The persistence of night fear also reflects the role of memory. Negative experiences, an attack in the dark, a venomous bite, are remembered more strongly than neutral or positive ones. This negativity bias, once protective, reinforces our association of darkness with danger. Even in childhood today, children fear monsters in closets or under beds. Developmental psychology suggests this is not simply cultural storytelling, but an expression of ancient caution mechanisms triggered by immaturity in a vulnerable stage of life. It is worth noting that firelight did more than illuminate. It extended social life into the night. Around flames, humans gathered, told stories, and sang. Fire may have softened the terror of darkness, but it also reinforced the idea that light was safety and dark was peril. The boundary between the lit circle and the shadows beyond became symbolic, a division between known and unknown. Our myths of demons and spirits lurking at night may be cultural elaborations of that same boundary. Even as civilizations grew, the problem never vanished. Ancient cities lit their streets with torches, but crime and danger still peaked after sunset. Roman writers described fears of walking alone at night. Medieval towns imposed curfews, bells marking the time when citizens should be indoors. These practices reflect the enduring reality that human senses and bodies were not adapted for darkness. Technology could mitigate but not erase the evolutionary unease. Today, electric light has extended day into night more completely than ever before. Yet fear of darkness persists. People still avoid unlit alleys, still feel uneasy in unfamiliar woods after sunset. Horror films exploit this ancient response, using shadows and sudden sounds to trigger physiological reactions millions of years in the making. The mismatch is clear. Our environment has changed, but the wiring of our brains has not. As scientists, we must remain humble. We cannot reconstruct every detail of how early humans felt about the night, but the convergence of archaeology, psychology, and neuroscience suggests a coherent picture. Fear of the dark was adaptive, it saved lives, and it became deeply embedded in our biology. That inheritance explains why we, with all our lights and locks, still flinch at shadows. And so, we end with a haunting question. If we still fear the dark in a world of electricity, what other ancient fears do we carry unnoticed, shaping our behaviour in ways that no longer fit our surroundings? The shadows in the room may be empty, but the shadows in our minds are full of memory. We live in a world of nations, religions, sports teams, political parties, and countless smaller allegiances. Billions of us now walk the earth, connected by trade, internet, and global institutions. And yet, for all this scale and supposed modernity, our minds still split the world into us and them. We choose tribes, defend them fiercely, and often believe what our group believes even when evidence suggests otherwise. The haunting question is this: why do billions of us still split into tribes? The answer begins deep in our evolutionary past. For at least 200,000 years, Homo sapiens lived in small groups where survival depended on cooperation. Loyalty to the group was not optional. To be cast out was to die. Anthropologists studying forager societies today note that membership is enforced not by contracts or written laws, but by shared values, norms, and beliefs. Gossip maintains reputations, stories reinforce morality, and collective rituals mark identity. These mechanisms create cohesion. The same mechanisms also create sharp boundaries between those who belong and those who do not. Our brains seem to be tuned for this kind of loyalty. Studies of social psychology reveal that humans privilege group membership over abstract truth. In experiments, people will often conform to a group's opinion even when their own eyes tell them it is wrong. This bias makes sense when viewed through evolutionary history. A lone dissenter in a small band might be correct about a fact, but if insisting on that truth led to ostracism, their survival chances plummeted. Aligning with the tribe, even at the cost of accuracy, kept you alive. Truth was negotiable, belonging was not. This deep logic still underpins much of human behaviour. Religion, nationalism, and political affiliation are modern manifestations of ancient loyalty systems. Anthropologist Ella Al-Shamay's own personal story illustrates this vividly. As she has recounted, she grew up within a conservative religious community, where rejecting creationist views was not simply a matter of disagreeing with science, it was equivalent to questioning the tribe itself. For her younger self, the scientists who spoke of evolution were not just wrong, they were outsiders, members of another tribe with alien values. Only through years of study, reflection, and painful departure from her original community did she adopt a new scientific worldview. Her story captures in miniature the larger dynamic. Beliefs are not merely individual choices, but social signals of allegiance. Archaeology also offers glimpses of this tribal logic in deep time. Distinct tool styles appear in different regions, even when raw materials and environments were similar. The persistence of such variation suggests that cultural markers were maintained as signs of group identity. Beads, pigments, and ornaments likewise carried symbolic weight, distinguishing one community from another. These were not simply practical differences, but badges of belonging. Tribal identity was literally worn on the body. The costs of tribal loyalty are equally ancient. Conflict between groups left its marks in skeletal injuries, fortified settlements, and later historical records. To defend one's tribe often meant aggression toward outsiders. Loyalty was the glue of survival, but it was also the tinder of violence. Our brains evolved to navigate this tension, cooperative within the group, wary or hostile beyond it. Even today, neuroscience studies show stronger empathetic responses to the suffering of in-group members compared to strangers. The wiring of the tribal mind remains stubbornly asymmetric. We must be cautious in drawing conclusions. Not every feature of tribal life in the past maps neatly onto modern behaviour. Ancient bands were small, while today's tribes can number in the millions. Still, the psychological mechanisms remain strikingly similar. Whether the group is a village, a nation, or a football club, the brain's circuits for loyalty and conformity light up in the same ways. The resilience of tribalism helps explain why global institutions struggle to override local identities. The United Nations may represent humanity as a whole, but most individuals feel stronger emotional ties to their immediate nation, community, or faith. Evolution prepared us to invest heavily in small groups where faces were known and reputations mattered. Global crowds stretch this instinct beyond its comfort zone, but the mind falls back on familiar patterns. We create subgroups within nations, factions within religions, parties within states. The tribe never disappears, it only scales. This resilience also explains why humans often defend beliefs that outsiders see as irrational. Once a conviction becomes entwined with group identity, rejecting it feels like betraying kin. Anthropologists studying climate denial or vaccine skepticism note that for many adherents, the issue is less about data than about allegiance. To change one's mind would mean leaving the tribe. For a brain shaped in prehistory, that is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. And so, the paradox is clear. Tribalism was once the glue that made survival possible, binding small groups through loyalty, ritual, and belief. In today's global crowds, the same instinct fragments us into factions. Our Stone Age minds still crave belonging, even at the cost of truth. This leaves us with the haunting question. Can a species built to live in tribes of 150 ever truly think as a global collective of billions? Or will we always carry within us the urge to split, to circle around the fire with our own, and to see the rest of humanity as them? The evidence of prehistory suggests the answer may not lie in erasing tribes, but in learning how to live with them, aware of the ancient logic that still shapes our modern crowds. 200,000 years ago, humans huddled around campfires to trade stories, share warnings, and reinforce bonds. Today, billions of us sit behind glowing screens, scrolling through feeds, commenting, and sharing. The technology has changed, but the impulse feels familiar. Social media promises connection, belonging, and information. Yet it also magnifies division, fuels anxiety, and exploits our ancient vulnerabilities. The question is this: did social media rewire our brains, or did it simply hijack our Stone Age ones? To answer, we must first remember the role of conversation in our evolutionary history. Gossip was not idle chatter. It was the social glue of bands and tribes, talking about who cooperated, who cheated, who could be trusted, and who could not allow groups to scale beyond immediate observation. Gossip extended the reach of memory. Around the fire, reputations were built and destroyed. The cost of exclusion was lethal, so people cared deeply about what others said. That sensitivity is still with us. Our brains are wired to pay attention to reputation cues, to the opinions of others, and to the subtle hierarchies of groups. Social media platforms from their emergence around the year 2000 onward tapped into these circuits. Likes, shares, and comments act as reputational signals, modern equivalents of nods and whispers around the campfire. Neuroscience studies show that receiving positive feedback on posts activates the brain's reward circuitry, releasing dopamine. The effect is reinforcing, encouraging more engagement. Yet the same systems are exquisitely sensitive to negative cues. Harsh comments, public shaming, or exclusion from online groups trigger the same circuits of pain and anxiety as rejection in face-to-face life. The digital campfire is global, but the emotions it evokes are ancient. Negativity bias plays a central role here. As evolutionary biologists remind us, humans are tuned to notice threats more than pleasures. A rustle in the grass might be a predator. Ignoring it could be fatal. Remembering insults more vividly than compliments once protected reputations in small groups. On social media, this bias translates into disproportionate attention to outrage, scandal, and conflict. Platforms that algorithmically promote engaging content often amplify anger and fear because those emotions spread faster and hold attention longer. The global campfire, instead of soothing, often burns hottest with negativity. Polarization follows. When billions gather in digital spaces, we do not become one tribe. Instead, the ancient machinery of in-groups and out-groups reasserts itself. Online, people cluster into communities of shared belief, reinforcing loyalty and identity. Disagreeing voices are treated not as alternative viewpoints, but as threats to tribal belonging. Algorithms designed to maximize engagement inadvertently deepen this divide by showing users more of what confirms their existing views. The result is echo chambers that feel natural to our Stone Age minds, but dangerous in a globalised world. It is tempting to see all this as unprecedented, but the patterns are continuous with our past. Storytelling around fires carried risks of rumour, exaggeration, and conflict too. Leaders could manipulate narratives, and groups could splinter over disputes. The difference is scale. What once happened within 100 people now happens across billions. The brain has not changed, the stage has. The costs of this mismatch are visible. Anxiety and depression rates have risen in many populations since the spread of social media. Constant comparison to curated images of others fuels dissatisfaction. Sleep is disrupted by the blue glow of screens, and attention spans fragment under constant notifications. These are not entirely new problems. Humans have always compared, competed, and worried. But the intensity and pervasiveness are novel. Our brains, evolved for slow fireside talk, now contend with torrents of information, much of it designed to exploit our biases. Still, we must be careful not to paint a one-sided picture. Social media has also enabled new forms of cooperation. Dispersed families maintain contact, marginalised voices find platforms, and collective action can mobilise across continents. The same ancient impulses toward gossip and belonging that can divide also enable solidarity. Like the fire that could both warm and burn, the digital campfire is double-edged. From an evolutionary perspective, what is striking is not that social media changed us, but that it fit us so well. It slotted into pre-existing circuits of reputation, reward, and fear. It did not need to rewire our brains. It only needed to exploit what was already there. That is why it spread so quickly, why it feels addictive, and why it provokes emotions that feel older than the internet itself. The haunting question is not whether social media has made us different, but whether we can consciously shape its use to align with what our brains can handle. Can a species designed to gossip around fires learn to manage gossip at planetary scale? Or are we forever at risk of letting ancient instincts, amplified by modern tools, destabilise the very societies those tools were meant to connect? What is perhaps most revealing about the digital campfire is how quickly it colonised the rhythms of our lives. Archaeologists measure cultural transitions in centuries or millennia. Farming took thousands of years to spread. Urbanisation unfolded slowly across regions. Social media, by contrast, went from novelty to near universal within barely 2 decades. That speed is not evidence of rewiring so much as proof of fit. The platform that most successfully harnessed our ancient instincts spread like wildfire because it resonated with what minds already wanted to do. Watch, compare, belong, exclude. The metrics of this fit are visible in time spent. Forager bands may have devoted hours each evening to conversation by firelight. Today, users spend comparable stretches scrolling, liking and posting. The difference is not in the duration but in the scope. Fireside talk involved familiar faces, voices and contexts. Online engagement involves strangers, celebrities, and curated fragments, often stripped of the cues that normally regulate human interaction. Tone, gesture, context. Our brains respond as though the stakes are the same, producing joy or shame, belonging or exclusion. But the volume is multiplied to a level our nervous systems were never meant to handle. The way information spreads also reveals this mismatch. Around a fire, a rumour might move through dozens of people in a night. Online, it can reach millions in minutes. The brain reacts as if hearing it from kin, even when the source is anonymous. Outrage, laughter, fear, all spread through networks designed to amplify attention, not truth. This is not new behaviour. It is ancient behaviour scaled up to a planetary system. That is why the digital campfire feels both familiar and overwhelming. And perhaps the most humbling realisation is that none of this was consciously designed to destabilise us. The platforms evolved by trial and error, much like tools in prehistory. Features that generated more engagement, like buttons, infinite scrolls, algorithmic feeds, were selected because they fit our brains so efficiently. The outcome, however, is that our deepest evolutionary biases now operate in an environment where they are constantly triggered, with little respite. For the nervous system built for a tribe of 150, the effect is exhaustion. We are left then with a paradox as old as humanity. Fire gave us warmth, stories and safety, but it could also burn, spread and consume. Social media is the same, a campfire that connects across the planet, yet threatens to scorch the very bonds it was meant to strengthen. The challenge is not to abandon the fire, but to learn, perhaps for the first time in our history, how to regulate an ancient instinct at global scale. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, millions of people around the world began to notice something strange. Their thumbs ached, their wrists tingled, and their fingers cramped after long days with small devices. Doctors gave the problem a name, BlackBerry thumb, after the popular handheld phone, and soon it became shorthand for a new kind of evolutionary mismatch. Our ancestors' hands had been honed to throw spears, grip tools and weave baskets. They were not designed to swipe, scroll and tap thousands of times a day. The question is this: why do phones break our bodies? Anatomy gives part of the answer. The human hand is a marvel of evolution. Opposable thumbs, fine motor control and sensitive fingertips made tool-making and symbolic expression possible. But these abilities evolved under conditions of varied and intermittent use. A day in the life of a forager involved walking, carrying, digging, throwing and gesturing, activities that spread mechanical stress across many joints and muscles. Repetition was present, but not in the relentless, uniform way modern devices demand. When mobile phones entered daily life in the late 20th century, the scale of repetitive motion shifted. Text messaging required rapid thumb movements, often at awkward angles. Later, touchscreens demanded constant swiping and tapping, concentrating stress on small tendons and joints. Medical reports from the early 2000s describe rising cases of tendinitis, carpal tunnel syndrome, and repetitive strain injuries linked directly to handheld devices. Our anatomy, flexible but limited, had no time to adapt. The span of 2 decades is a blink compared to the hundreds of thousands of years it took to shape the hand. The problem is not just mechanical. Prolonged device use alters posture, drawing shoulders forward and bending necks downward. Tech neck, as some clinicians call it, places strain on vertebrae and muscles unused to such sustained angles. Eye fatigue adds another layer. Foragers evolved to scan landscapes at varied distances. Now we focus inches from our faces for hours, exposed to blue light that disrupts circadian rhythms. Again, the body has no evolutionary preparation for this environment. Statistics highlight the scale of the mismatch. Surveys in the 2010s showed teenagers sending thousands of texts per month, sometimes hundreds per day. Adults too increasingly relied on devices for work, navigation and communication. Orthopedic clinics reported dramatic rises in repetitive strain injuries among young people. Conditions once associated with factory or office labour now appeared in schoolchildren. The devices did not rewire our bodies, they simply exploited them beyond design limits. This is not to say that evolution never prepared us for endurance. The human body excels at sustained walking, long-distance running, and flexible problem-solving. But there are thresholds. A thumb that excels at gripping tools does not excel at 20,000 microswipes in a single week. A spine that supports varied motion falters under endless hunching. We are Stone Age bodies confronted with demands they never encountered in ancestral life. There is also a social dimension. Injuries of this kind are often dismissed because they lack dramatic visibility. A sprained ankle or a broken bone is obvious. Tendon inflammation is not. Yet for sufferers, the consequences are real. Chronic pain, reduced mobility, disrupted sleep. Archaeologists remind us that the skeletons of early farmers show wear from grinding grain, just as medieval scribes show strain from constant writing. Today, our strain is digital. Different tools, same pattern, our bodies paying the cost of new cultural practices. The story is still unfolding. Voice recognition, haptic feedback, and new interfaces may change how we interact with technology, spreading the load more evenly across the body. But for now, the evidence suggests that our hands, eyes, and spines are in conflict with the devices we depend upon. We cannot evolve quickly enough to keep pace. And so we arrive at the haunting question. If phones already break our bodies in mere decades, What happens as devices become even more embedded in our daily lives? Are we witnessing only the first wave of mismatches, with deeper costs yet to emerge? Or can we learn, unlike many times before, to design tools with the limits of our ancient anatomy in mind? The answer is not yet clear. What is clear is that our thumbs, those small miracles of evolution, were built to grasp the world, not to scroll endlessly through it. If you step back and look at the conditions of human life in the 21st century, the picture seems astonishing. Most people today are unlikely to be killed by wild animals. Famine, while still real in places, is rarer than ever before. Medicine can treat infections that once wiped out villages. Infant survival rates are higher than at any other time in history. Yet in surveys across nations, people report unprecedented levels of anxiety, stress, and a pervasive sense of insecurity. The haunting question is this: why do the safest humans in history feel the most unsafe? The answer lies in the mismatch between ancient minds and modern abundance. For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived with scarcity. Food was uncertain, danger was immediate, and survival depended on vigilance. Evolution selected for nervous systems that prioritized threats over comforts. Remembering the path where a lion lurked mattered more than enjoying the patch where berries grew. Worrying about tomorrow's hunger mattered more than basking in today's satiety. These tendencies, adaptive in a world of scarcity, now persist in a world of plenty. Psychologists call this the negativity bias. Experiments consistently show that humans react more strongly to losses than to equivalent gains. Losing $50 feels more painful than gaining $50 feels pleasurable. This asymmetry echoes our evolutionary past, when a single mistake, eating the wrong plant, ignoring a warning sound, could be fatal. Natural selection favoured those who erred on the side of caution. In the modern world, the same bias fuels anxiety about finances, health and status even when material conditions are secure. Status adds another layer. In small groups, social rank influenced access to resources and mates. Being excluded or losing prestige could reduce survival chances. Our brains therefore evolved to monitor relative position obsessively. Anthropologists studying forager bands note that gossip often centres on fairness, sharing, and reputation. In today's societies of millions, this vigilance has no off switch. Social comparison now extends to strangers, celebrities, and curated images online. Even in abundance, people feel deprived because they are wired to evaluate themselves against others. Status anxiety is a Stone Age adaptation misfiring in the 21st century. Another contributor is unpredictability. Foragers faced uncertainty daily, but they managed it through immediate return systems. Food was gathered and eaten within days, and trust was maintained through sharing. Modern humans, by contrast, face abstract uncertainties. Markets, careers, pensions, global politics. The scale of unpredictability overwhelms systems designed for tangible threats. The result is chronic stress, an ancient fight-or-flight response triggered by invisible forces like interest rates or job security. Biology confirms the toll. Cortisol, the hormone that surges under stress, is designed for short-term bursts. In ancestral environments, it readied the body to fight predators or flee danger. Today, it is often elevated chronically, linked to insomnia, weight gain, weakened immunity, and mood disorders. The safest humans in history carry biochemical signatures of constant alarm, not because lions lurk in the grass, but because emails, deadlines, and imagined losses keep ancient circuits firing. It is important to avoid simple nostalgia. Life in the past was not free from anxiety. Hunter-gatherers worried about famine, injury, and intergroup conflict. But their stress was acute and episodic, resolved when the danger passed. Modern stress is diffuse and enduring. Instead of spikes, we endure drips, an IV of unease that rarely shuts off. This chronicity may explain why anxiety disorders are among the most common mental health conditions worldwide today. The paradox is clearest in affluent societies. Here, people enjoy unprecedented lifespans, caloric abundance, and technological convenience, yet report high levels of dissatisfaction and fear. The evolutionary lens helps make sense of this contradiction. Minds sculpted to anticipate scarcity cannot simply switch off in abundance. Instead, they redirect vigilance toward relative deprivation and imagined threats. The safer the environment, the more space there is for abstract worries to fill the void. This does not mean anxiety is meaningless. The same vigilance that misfires in abundance also fuels innovation, planning, and cooperation. A nervous system that cannot fully relax remains motivated to solve problems, but the costs are evident. Rising rates of burnout, insomnia, and stress-related illness testify to the mismatch. We are bodies built for scarcity, now living in abundance, and our minds have not yet caught up. And so we circle back to the haunting question: if our ancient stress systems cannot find peace in plenty, can they ever find peace at all? Or is anxiety destined to shadow humanity as long as Stone Age brains navigate modern worlds of skyscrapers, supermarkets, and screens? The evidence so far suggests that fear was never meant to vanish. It was meant to keep us alive. What it was never meant to do was follow us endlessly into abundance. What complicates the story of modern anxiety further is that safety itself has become strangely invisible. For most of human history, the absence of danger was fleeting, never guaranteed. A quiet night might always be interrupted by a predator, a rival, or a sudden storm. Today, systems of law, medicine, and infrastructure shield most people from these acute threats so consistently that we rarely notice them. Roads are paved, water is purified, and police or hospitals respond when emergencies arise. But because our nervous systems evolved to scan for what could go wrong, not for what is reliably going right, safety fades into the background. What stands out are the gaps, the rare crimes, the occasional accidents, the headlines of disaster. The very rarity of these events sharpens their psychological impact, making modern people feel more vulnerable than they are. There is also the irony of abundance itself. The supermarket shelf piled high with food choices may seem like the antithesis of scarcity. Yet behavioural economics shows that too much choice can heighten anxiety. In ancestral settings, the decision was often binary: eat or do not eat, fight or flee. Today's constant micro-decisions, what to buy, what to wear, what to click, overload circuits designed for simpler choices. Psychologists call this decision fatigue. It leaves people restless and unsatisfied even when every option is safe. Anthropologists point to another mismatch: the erosion of tight-knit community. Foragers relied on face-to-face bonds and shared burdens. Anxiety could be soothed by immediate reassurance from kin. In modern cities, individuals often live surrounded by strangers, connected more through institutions than through personal ties. Loneliness is reported at high rates even in crowded metropolises. The nervous system interprets isolation as danger, because in ancestral conditions, separation from the group meant vulnerability. Thus, the paradox emerges. One can be safer than ever before in a physical sense, yet feel more unsafe because the old cues of safety, close community, shared vigilance, visible cooperation, are missing. Even cultural storytelling reinforces the mismatch. Myths and rituals in small groups once provided frameworks for interpreting danger and resilience. Modern humans inherit media that thrives on dramatizing risk. News cycles dominated by catastrophe. Entertainment built on suspense and fear. These narratives hijack ancient circuits that are attuned to listen carefully when danger is described. A rumour of lions once spread through a camp. Now it is a breaking headline about market crashes or global unrest. The brain responds as if both were immediate threats. What is most humbling in all this is that anxiety is not an error but a feature, honed over millennia to preserve us. The mismatch is that the calibration is wrong for today's environment. We no longer need to carry constant dread into the supermarket aisle, or into bed at night. But evolution has no mechanism to recalibrate in just a few generations. The result is a species living with echoes of dangers that are no longer there, still wired to brace at shadows, even in the age of plenty. Imagine plucking a handful of wild berries 10,000 years ago. The sweetness would have been rare, fleeting, and precious. Or picture the relief of finding animal fat after weeks of lean game, the salt from mineral deposits, the satisfaction of a roasted marrow bone. In a world of scarcity, these tastes were signals. Eat now, store energy, survive tomorrow. Yet walk into a supermarket today, and those same signals are everywhere. packaged, processed, amplified far beyond their natural forms, and instead of saving us, they are slowly killing us. The question is this: why does food that once saved us now kill us? The roots lie in the evolutionary logic of craving. Humans, like many animals, evolved preferences that guided survival. Sweetness signalled sugar, a dense source of calories. Bitterness often signalled toxins, so we learned to avoid it. Salt was essential for nerve and muscle function, yet rare in inland environments, so the tongue evolved to prize it. Fat carried more than double the calories per gram compared to carbohydrates or protein, making it the ideal energy reserve in uncertain times. Craving these flavours ensured that when they were found, they were eaten, and when they were eaten, they sustained life through famine. Anthropological studies of forager diets confirm this. The Hadza of Tanzania, one of the last remaining hunter-gatherer societies, cherish honey as a seasonal prize, consuming it in abundance when available. Arctic foragers relied heavily on fat from seals and whales, essential in cold climates. Salt was collected with effort from coastal deposits, or traded across long distances. Each taste preference was tuned to scarcity, not abundance. The systems worked because the environment placed natural limits on access. Agriculture changed the equation. Domesticated grains, legumes and livestock provided more reliable calories, but the true revolution came much later with industrial processing. In the 18th century, sugar production expanded through colonial plantations, turning what was once rare into a daily staple. In the 20th century, refined carbohydrates, vegetable oils, and added salts proliferated in processed foods. The environment shifted from scarcity to overabundance within a few generations. Evolution had no time to adjust. The same taste preferences that once saved lives now lead to overconsumption. Biology helps explain why restraint is so difficult. Dopamine pathways in the brain respond strongly to sugar and fat, rewarding consumption with pleasure. Neuroscientists describe this as a hedonic system designed to reinforce adaptive behaviours. In the ancestral past, the system balanced need and opportunity. In the modern world, it is hijacked by engineered foods designed to maximise bliss points. The precise combinations of sugar, salt, and fat that trigger the strongest reward responses. Snack aisles are, in a sense, laboratories exploiting ancient cravings. The consequences are visible worldwide. Rates of type 2 diabetes, hypertension and cardiovascular disease have risen dramatically in the last century. Yet these conditions are not new in kind. Ancient skeletons occasionally show evidence of dental cavities, often linked to high starch or honey consumption. Gout plagued elites who indulged in rich foods. What is new is the scale. Once limited to rare individuals or classes, mismatched diseases of diet now affect billions. The global food environment has overwhelmed the evolutionary design of the palate. There is also the paradox of abundance without satisfaction. Studies show that highly processed foods can lead to cycles of craving and overconsumption without lasting satiation. Our digestive and hormonal systems evolved to process fibrous plants, lean proteins and slow-digesting carbohydrates. Modern foods, stripped of fibre and concentrated in sugars, flood the bloodstream quickly, spiking insulin and then crashing energy levels. The brain interprets the crash as hunger, triggering further cravings. What once served as a survival mechanism becomes a trap. Anthropologists sometimes call this the Paleolithic hangover. We live with bodies and minds adapted for environments we no longer inhabit. The craving for sweetness is not wrong. It is ancient wisdom misplaced in modern abundance. The desire for salt is not irrational. It is the echo of countless ancestors who needed it to live. The taste for fat is not gluttony by design. It is the legacy of survival in lean times. The mismatch is not in the craving, but in the context. It is humbling to acknowledge that science cannot yet fully disentangle how to recalibrate these systems. Diets modelled on ancestral patterns, rich in unprocessed plants, moderate in meat, low in added sugars, appear to reduce mismatched diseases, but global lifestyles and economies make such diets difficult to sustain universally. We know enough to recognise the pattern, but not enough to engineer an easy solution. So we return to the haunting question. If the very cravings that saved our ancestors now undermine our health, What does that say about the future of a species living in perpetual abundance? Can we adapt behaviourally faster than biology can adapt genetically? Or will we remain trapped by appetites designed for a cave we left behind, forever torn between survival wisdom and supermarket temptation? One way to appreciate how deep this mismatch runs is to look at how human cultures have ritualized food. Across societies, feasts mark abundance, harvest festivals, religious celebrations, weddings. In ancestral contexts, these moments were rare punctuation marks in lives otherwise constrained by scarcity. The feasts mattered precisely because they contrasted with ordinary hunger. Today, however, the cultural impulse towards celebration collides with environments of constant availability. Every day can resemble a feast, which blunts the very meaning of celebration and pushes ancient circuits into overdrive. Another perspective comes from archaeology. Stable isotope analysis of ancient skeletons allows scientists to reconstruct diets across millennia. The results show remarkable diversity: fish-heavy diets along coasts, tuber-rich diets inland, meat-centered diets in cold climates. What they do not show is uniform reliance on concentrated sugars, salts, and fats. Even the wealthiest elites of the Bronze Age or Classical Antiquity rarely consumed what today's children can buy with pocket change. The mismatch is not only evolutionary but historical. The human palate that guided survival for hundreds of thousands of years encountered industrial-scale abundance only in the last few generations. Cravings also extend beyond energy needs. Anthropologists studying salt use in early farming societies find evidence of trade networks that stretched for hundreds of kilometres, all to secure this mineral. Salt was not just a flavour enhancer, but a physiological necessity, critical for hydration and muscle function. Our desire for it reflects genuine need, but once the modern world made it ubiquitous, added to bread, preserved meats, processed snacks, it ceased to be a rare prize and became a constant excess. A craving that once drove long journeys and forged alliances now drives chronic hypertension. Even the psychology of comfort food speaks to our ancient inheritance. High-fat, high-sugar meals stimulate reward pathways and reduce short-term stress responses, echoing the evolutionary role of stored energy in times of hardship. The modern idea of soothing oneself with chocolate or fried food is a cultural overlay on a biological truth. Calories once equaled safety. The problem is that stress today is rarely followed by famine. Instead, the comfort response becomes habitual and the mismatch widens. The humbling part of this story is that our cravings are not flaws to be scolded, but echoes to be understood. Every sweet tooth is a fossil of ancient survival. Every salt craving is a memory of scarcity. Every hunger for fat is a whisper from ancestors who lived one hard winter to the next. Recognizing this does not solve the modern dilemma, but it reframes it. The enemy is not the appetite itself, but the environment that has weaponized it. And that leaves us with a quiet but difficult question. If the world has changed faster than biology, can culture, through science, education, and restraint, step in as the new regulator of cravings? Or will the cave we left behind continue to shape our desires long after the cave itself is gone? Close your eyes in a modern bedroom, and you will find yourself surrounded by quiet machines. Clocks glowing, chargers blinking, streetlights pressing through the curtains, the faint hum of distant traffic. Yet for most of our species' history, night meant something very different. Darkness was near total, broken only by the pale wash of moonlight or the flicker of a fire. Sleep unfolded in rhythms tuned to the rising and setting of the sun, anchored by the cycle of light and dark that had governed all life for billions of years. The haunting question is this: why can't our Stone Age bodies sleep in the 21st century? The story begins deep in prehistory. Circadian rhythms, the internal cycles of roughly 24 hours that govern sleep, hunger, and hormone release, are found across animals and plants. In humans, these rhythms were set by light. Specialized cells in the eye, distinct from those used for vision, detect brightness and send signals to the brain's suprachiasmatic nucleus, the master clock. For hundreds of thousands of years, this system aligned human activity with the sun. Morning light triggered wakefulness. Evening darkness encouraged melatonin release and sleepiness. Firelight extended wakefulness modestly, but its spectrum was warm and dim, far less disruptive to circadian signals than the harsh blue light of modern bulbs. Anthropologists studying present-day forager groups provide clues to ancestral sleep. Among the Hadza in Tanzania, or the San in southern Africa, sleep is segmented rather than uniform. People often drift off soon after dark, wake for a period in the night, then sleep again until dawn. This first sleep, second sleep pattern, once common in pre-industrial societies, reflects the flexibility of human sleep within natural constraints. Importantly, it unfolded under darkness and firelight, not electric lamps or glowing screens. Sleep was social as well as biological. People slept near kin, and someone often remained awake, providing security in the night. The Industrial Revolution and the spread of artificial lighting changed this ancient pattern in barely 2 centuries. Gas lamps, then incandescent bulbs, extended activity far past sunset. Work hours shifted, nightlife flourished, and sleep began to shrink. Studies of factory towns in the 19th century describe workers sleeping fewer hours than rural neighbours, their nights carved up by shifts and long commutes. By the 20th century, electric light had become nearly universal, allowing humans to banish darkness at will. Our biology, however, did not change. The circadian system still responds to light as if it were sunlight, suppressing melatonin and delaying sleep when exposed to brightness in the evening. The arrival of screens intensified the mismatch. Televisions, computers, smartphones and tablets emit high levels of short wavelength blue light, the very spectrum most effective at resetting circadian rhythms. Using such devices at night tells the brain, in effect, that it is midday. Research shows that exposure to screens before bedtime delays melatonin release, reduces sleep duration, and fragments sleep quality. For a nervous system calibrated to firelight and moonlight, the glow of a phone is profoundly confusing. Insomnia, once a minor complaint, has become a widespread epidemic. Surveys suggest that nearly 1 in 3 adults in industrialized societies experiences chronic difficulty falling or staying asleep. Sleep duration has declined in many populations, with average nightly rest falling below 7 hours for large segments of the population. The consequences are broad: impaired memory, weakened immunity, heightened risk of cardiovascular disease, and increased vulnerability to mental health disorders. Our Stone Age bodies depend on sleep for restoration, yet our modern environments relentlessly erode it. It is worth noting that humans are not unusual in needing sleep. Every studied animal sleeps, from insects to mammals. What makes humans distinctive is how we manipulate our environment to override natural cycles. No lion or bird can flood its habitat with artificial light. Only humans can turn night into day, and only humans, it seems, can create insomnia as a cultural byproduct. Archaeological remains cannot tell us how well our ancestors slept, but ethnographic comparisons and evolutionary reasoning suggest they were not immune to disturbance. Noise, predators, and hunger disrupted rest too. What differs today is the chronic systemic disruption of circadian rhythms by technology itself. Even architecture plays a role. Modern bedrooms are often sealed from natural light, making mornings dim and evenings bright, the reverse of ancestral conditions. Office workers spend much of the day under artificial light weaker than true daylight, then return home to environments illuminated intensely at night. This inversion leaves circadian clocks drifting, unsure of when day begins or ends. Jet lag, once rare, is now routine for millions, further confusing biological rhythms. The science is still unfolding, and we should be humble about what we know. Not all insomnia is caused by light. Stress, irregular schedules, and individual variation matter too. Yet the convergence of evidence, from laboratory studies of melatonin suppression to field studies of forager sleep, suggests a clear pattern. Our bodies evolved for nights of darkness and days of bright light, and we have inverted that equation. The haunting question lingers. If sleep is as ancient and essential as breathing, what happens when a species systematically undermines it? Can cultural adjustments, dimming lights, limiting screens, redesigning work schedules, restore what biology demands? Or are we destined to live as insomniacs in the 21st century, our Stone Age bodies still waiting for the darkness that never comes? Evolution is often described as a relentless filter. a process that rewards survival and reproduction while eliminating traits that hinder them. For hundreds of thousands of years, this filter shaped our bodies and minds with unflinching severity. Infants who could not survive infection did not grow to adulthood. Individuals with infertility left no descendants. Genetic disorders that prevented reproduction faded from populations. Then, within a single century, the filter shifted. Antibiotics cured infections that once killed. Vaccines prevented diseases before they took hold. Fertility treatments allowed families once deemed biologically impossible. Glasses corrected poor eyesight, surgery repaired defects, and advanced medicine sustained lives well beyond reproductive years. The haunting question arises: did we stop evolving when we invented medicine? The claim is provocative, and Ella Al-Shamahi and other evolutionary biologists have suggested it in interviews. Natural selection, they argue, is weaker now than ever before. Traits that once would have been strongly selected against, like infertility, severe allergies, or congenital disorders, no longer prevent survival or reproduction in the same way. If survival is no longer tightly linked to biology, the mechanism of evolution appears muted. But we must examine carefully what this means. Consider infectious disease. For most of human history, epidemics shape populations dramatically. Archaeology reveals waves of mortality from tuberculosis, leprosy, and plague. Survivors passed on resistant alleles, gradually altering gene frequencies. In the 20th century, antibiotics transformed this landscape. Diseases that once culled populations, strep infections, syphilis, bacterial pneumonias, became treatable. Natural selection lost one of its most powerful filters. Yet pathogens evolve rapidly, and the arms race continues. Antibiotic resistance is now a global crisis, a reminder that evolution never halts. It only changes participants. Infertility offers another lens. By definition, infertility reduces reproductive success. In the past, individuals who could not conceive simply left no genetic descendants. Today, technologies like in vitro fertilization allow many to have children despite underlying biological barriers. The result is that alleles contributing to infertility may persist in the gene pool rather than being pruned away. From a strict Darwinian perspective, this represents a weakening of natural selection. Yet from a human perspective, it represents triumph, a refusal to let biology dictate destiny. Vision provides a subtler example. Myopia is widespread in many modern populations. In ancestral environments, severe nearsightedness might have reduced survival chances, impairing hunting or gathering. Today, glasses, contact lenses, and corrective surgery make it nearly irrelevant. Millions of people thrive with a condition that would once have been disadvantageous. Here too, medicine alters the balance of selection. But does this mean evolution has truly stopped? Most evolutionary biologists say no. Selection pressure has not disappeared. It has shifted. Human reproduction is still influenced by social, cultural, and economic forces. Genes that once conferred advantage in one context may now be neutral, or even disadvantageous in another. The rise of caesarean sections, for example, allows babies with larger heads to survive birth, potentially altering selection on pelvic dimensions. Global migration mixes gene pools at unprecedented rates, reshaping variation in ways unfamiliar to the past. Moreover, medicine extends life beyond reproduction, influencing the social environment of survival. Grandparents live long enough to help rear grandchildren, a phenomenon sometimes called the grandmother effect. While genes may not be selected directly through late survival, the cultural and social contributions of older individuals alter group success, which in turn affects the transmission of knowledge, values, and behaviour. Evolution is not only genetic but cultural, and medicine amplifies the cultural pathway by keeping more people alive longer. We must remain humble here. Evolutionary processes unfold over thousands of years, not mere decades. Claims that evolution has stopped may underestimate the subtle ways selection continues. For example, global studies show that lactose tolerance spread in just the last 10,000 years, shaped by dairy consumption. In similar ways, genes affecting metabolism, immunity, and fertility may still shift under new pressures, though more slowly and less visibly than in the past. Medicine changes the rules, but it does not remove the game. The question is perhaps not whether we stopped evolving, but whether we are now evolving differently. Instead of selection against weakness, we see persistence of diversity. Instead of survival linked solely to biology, we see survival mediated through technology and culture. Evolution may be less about elimination and more about accommodation. This raises profound questions about the future. Will human populations accumulate traits that were once pruned away, leading to new dependencies on medicine and technology? Or will cultural and technological evolution simply take the place of biological adaptation, creating a species that survives not by genes alone, but by inventions? The haunting question remains unresolved. Medicine has indeed weakened the harshness of natural selection, but it has not erased evolution. It has redirected it, softened it, and entangled it with culture in ways no previous species has experienced. The Stone Age filter of survival is gone, replaced by antibiotics, vaccines, and fertility clinics. Whether that makes us freer or more fragile is a question only time can answer. Another angle on this question comes from population genetics. Even if medicine reduces mortality from certain conditions, gene frequencies still shift simply because not everyone reproduces equally. Access to medicine itself varies dramatically across the globe. In some regions, advanced fertility treatments and neonatal care are widespread. In others, basic antibiotics remain scarce. This unevenness means that the evolutionary pressures on different populations are not identical. In effect, medicine has created new selective environments defined by economics and geography, rather than by predators or famine. There is also the question of trade-offs. Some genetic traits that predispose to disease in modern contexts may once have been advantageous. The sickle cell allele is the classic example. Carriers of a single copy have increased resistance to malaria, while carriers of 2 copies suffer from sickle cell disease. With modern medicine, more individuals with the disease survive and reproduce, changing how the allele circulates. Yet malaria itself continues to exert selective pressure in endemic regions. Medicine, in this case, has complicated but not erased evolutionary dynamics. The rise of chronic conditions highlights another shift. Heart disease, diabetes, and many cancers often develop later in life, frequently after reproduction has occurred. From the perspective of natural selection, these conditions matter less, because evolution is primarily concerned with traits that affect reproductive success. Medicine allows people to live with such conditions for decades, but the underlying evolutionary logic was never about post-reproductive survival. This discrepancy raises uncomfortable questions. Are we now carrying genetic vulnerabilities into the future that selection once would have removed? Or were these vulnerabilities always there, simply hidden by shorter lifespans? There is also the cultural lens. Some anthropologists argue that humans have effectively outsourced evolution to culture. Instead of waiting for genetic changes, we alter our environments through tools, institutions, and technologies. Eyeglasses compensate for poor vision, vaccines compensate for weak immunity, and digital tools compensate for memory limits. From this view, medicine is not the end of evolution, but a new layer of it, a cultural adaptation layered on top of biological ones. Evolution continues, but its primary driver has shifted from genes alone to the interaction between genes and culture. Looking ahead, genetics and biotechnology may alter the equation even further. Gene editing technologies such as CRISPR raise the possibility of directly altering the human genome, bypassing the slow grind of natural selection altogether. This would not stop evolution but redirect it by conscious design. Whether humanity should take that path is a philosophical and ethical question, but it underscores the reality that medicine and evolution are no longer separate stories. They're entangled, shaping one another in ways our ancestors could never have imagined. What remains uncertain is how sustainable this path is. By softening selection, medicine has granted us longer lives and broader diversity, but it may also have increased dependence on the very technologies that sustain us. The humbling reality is that evolution did not prepare us for antibiotics, vaccines, or gene editing. These are tools we gave ourselves, and the long-term consequences are only beginning to unfold. We live in an age when science has achieved feats once unimaginable. Vaccines eradicate diseases that terrified our ancestors, satellites map the globe in real time, and climate models warn us of long-term planetary changes with astonishing precision. Yet at the very moment science wields such power, large segments of society turn away from it. Movements deny climate change despite overwhelming evidence. Parents refuse vaccines even as preventable outbreaks return. Conspiracy theories flourish, painting laboratories and scientists as villains. The haunting question is this: why do tribes distrust science, even when it saves them? The roots of this paradox run deep into human evolution. Trust in information has never been about evidence alone. For most of our species' history, the credibility of a claim depended less on logic than on who said it. When a bandmate warned of a predator near the river, the crucial factor was not peer-reviewed data, but whether you trusted the speaker as part of your group. Loyalty outweighed objectivity, and this bias was adaptive. To question every claim would have wasted precious time. To believe outsiders over insiders risked ostracism. Our brains became tuned to value group membership as the ultimate filter of truth. This ancient mechanism persists today. Sociologists studying vaccine hesitancy and climate denial find that beliefs often cluster along tribal lines: religious, political, cultural. When people reject scientific evidence, it is rarely because they cannot understand it. Instead, accepting it would place them at odds with their community. A mother in a vaccine-skeptical group may feel that trusting science threatens her bond with friends, family or faith. A farmer in a coal-dependent region may feel that acknowledging climate change betrays neighbours whose livelihoods depend on fossil fuels. The logic is ancient. Better to risk being wrong with the group than to be right alone. The 20th century amplified this mismatch. Mass media, once thought to unify, created competing sources of authority. Television, radio, and later the internet multiplied voices, each claiming legitimacy. Trust in institutions, governments, universities, health agencies, rose at first but declined sharply by the late 20th century. Scandals, misinformation, and partisan battles eroded confidence. Into this vacuum, tribal identity surged back. Beliefs about vaccines or climate science became not just factual claims but badges of loyalty. Agreeing with science or rejecting it became less about data than about signalling which side you belong to. Anthropology provides instructive parallels. In small-scale societies, knowledge is distributed and contextual. Hunting techniques vary by tribe, even when the environment is similar. Rituals and myths encode ecological wisdom, but they are believed not because they are empirically tested, but because they are socially sanctioned. In modern contexts, scientific knowledge functions differently. It demands trust in distant experts, in processes invisible to laypeople. For many, that kind of trust feels alien. When a scientist in a white coat explains DNA or climate models, it can resemble, to the evolved brain, the proclamations of an outsider tribe. The post-truth era, as many scholars now call it, crystallizes this dynamic. Misinformation spreads not because it is convincing in itself, but because it resonates with group identity. A claim that vaccines are dangerous persists not because of overwhelming evidence, none exists, but because repeating it signals loyalty to a skeptical community. Likewise, climate denial endures not because data are lacking, but because belief aligns with the interests and identity of certain groups. In this sense, the distrust of science is less a failure of reason than a triumph of tribal logic. Yet this does not mean truth is irrelevant. Science continues to work whether people believe in it or not. Planes fly, medicines heal, climate systems respond to carbon. The tragedy is that when trust erodes, the benefits of science become uneven. Communities that reject vaccines suffer preventable outbreaks. Nations that deny climate change delay adaptation and face harsher consequences. The mismatch between ancient tribal instincts and modern global problems has tangible costs. As humble scientists, we must acknowledge another factor. Science itself has not always lived up to its ideals. History records cases of unethical experiments, of knowledge withheld for political gain, of arrogance in communication. These failures provide fuel for distrust, even when contemporary science strives for transparency. To rebuild trust, it is not enough to present more evidence. Trust must be earned through humility, openness, and recognition that humans are tribal by nature. The haunting question, then, is whether humanity can transcend this ancient filter of loyalty and time to meet global challenges. Can billions of Stone Age brains learn to trust evidence over identity when survival depends on it? Or will our tribal instincts continue to fracture trust, leaving us vulnerable not to lions in the grass but to crises of our own making? Another way to see this crisis of trust is to examine moments when science succeeded spectacularly, yet still met resistance. The eradication of smallpox in the late 20th century stands as one of humanity's greatest triumphs. Through coordinated global vaccination campaigns, a disease that once killed millions vanished. Yet even during that campaign, rumours spread that vaccines were unsafe or carried hidden agendas. Resistance was not born of evidence, but of suspicion toward outsiders delivering them. The pattern has repeated with polio, measles, and so on. Scientific achievement can extinguish a virus, but it cannot extinguish the tribal reflex to distrust what comes from beyond one's group. Climate science tells a similar story. In the mid-20th century, early models of atmospheric carbon dioxide accumulation aligned remarkably well with observations. By the late 20th century, the consensus was clear. Human activity was warming the planet. Yet political and cultural divisions quickly overwhelmed the evidence. Fossil fuel industries funded campaigns of doubt. Communities whose livelihoods depended on coal or oil resisted findings that threatened their economic survival. Over time, denial became less about carbon data and more about identity. In some regions, to acknowledge climate change felt like betraying one's community. Science did not fail in accuracy, but trust fractured along tribal lines. What makes these episodes so powerful is that they reveal how information travels differently than we imagine. We like to think truth rises by weight of evidence, but in practice, it spreads through social networks. A claim endorsed by a trusted neighbour, pastor or politician carries more influence than a graph in a journal. Evolution prepared us to value social trust as the ultimate arbiter. In ancestral groups, this was a safe bet. In global societies, it can be perilous. The crisis is compounded by the speed of modern communication. Social media allows misinformation to leap across continents in hours. The tribal instincts behind it are ancient, but the amplification is new. A rumour that once might have stayed within a village now reaches millions, reinforced by echo chambers. Each retweet or repost functions like a nod around the fire, confirming group identity even if the content is false. The sobering part of this mismatch is that the stakes have grown. Distrust of science in the past might have cost a few lives within a band or village. Today, it can shape planetary-scale outcomes: global warming, pandemic spread, antibiotic resistance. The mismatch is no longer local, it is existential. And so the haunting question deepens. Can science, a practice built on evidence and uncertainty, learn to coexist with minds built for loyalty and belonging? Or will trust continue to fracture, leaving our greatest achievements vulnerable to the very instincts that once kept our ancestors alive? Science presents itself as the antidote to tribalism. It is supposed to be a method, not an identity, a way of testing claims against reality rather than a banner to rally under. Yet in recent decades, critics including Ella al-Shamahi have raised an unsettling question. Has science itself become a tribe? If so, the very institution designed to cut through bias may now be trapped in the same evolutionary logic that shaped every other human group. The haunting question is this: can science survive if it becomes just another tribe among many? The origins of modern science in the 19th century were framed as universal. Figures like Darwin, Pasteur, and Maxwell presented ideas intended to transcend national and cultural boundaries. The Royal Society in London adopted the motto nullius in verba, take nobody's word for it, as a declaration that evidence, not authority, would govern claims. In theory, science was open to anyone, regardless of origin or belief. In practice, though, participation was always shaped by social context. Science thrived in particular regions: Western Europe, North America, Japan, while other traditions were sidelined. Even at its birth, science bore the imprint of culture, class, and politics. In the 20th century, science became more institutionalized. Universities, government agencies, and corporations funded research, setting agendas and boundaries. This institutional framework brought enormous successes: nuclear physics, molecular biology, space exploration. Yet it also deepened the association of science with particular political and cultural identities. In the United States, for example, science was closely tied to secular universities, coastal elites, and progressive politics. By the late 20th century, surveys showed that self-identified conservatives were less likely to trust scientific institutions, while liberals increasingly embraced science as part of their identity. A practice meant to rise above tribal loyalties was now being absorbed into them. Ella al-Shamahi points to this as an existential risk. If science is perceived as a left-leaning tribe, then those outside that tribe will treat it with suspicion, regardless of the evidence it produces. Vaccine skepticism, climate denial, and rejection of evolutionary biology all thrive not because of the strength of counter-arguments, but because of the perception that science belongs to the other side. When identity trumps data, truth itself becomes tribal currency. There are concrete examples of how exclusion sharpens this problem. Religious scientists often report hiding their faith in academic contexts, fearing ridicule or dismissal. Right-leaning scientists worry about being ostracized or denied platforms. Controversial figures such as Jordan Peterson or Elon Musk become flashpoints, their exclusion reinforcing the perception that science tolerates only certain ideological stances. The effect is self-reinforcing. The more science appears to belong to one tribe, the less those in other tribes feel invested in its conclusions. This polarization is not unique to science. Every human institution reflects the evolutionary pull of in-groups and out-groups. Yet for science, the stakes are higher. If bridges collapse, vaccines fail, or climate predictions prove inaccurate, societies pay immediate costs. Trust in science cannot afford to fracture along partisan lines. And yet, from an evolutionary perspective, it is easy to see why it does. Humans did not evolve to trust abstract methods. We evolved to trust people like us. When scientists speak, listeners often hear not the data but the identity of the speaker. The question then is whether science can reclaim its position as a universal method rather than a partisan identity. Some argue that the solution lies in deliberate pluralism, welcoming religious voices, political diversity and cultural perspectives into the scientific community, provided they adhere to methodological rigour. Others caution that broadening the tent risks diluting standards, allowing ideology to masquerade as evidence. The tension is real, yet history shows that diverse perspectives often enrich science. Fields such as evolutionary biology, medicine, and anthropology have advanced through dialogue between competing views, not through uniformity. The humbling truth is that science is made by humans, and humans are tribal animals. Even within the scientific community, rival schools, laboratories, and theories compete for prestige, funding, and recognition. Peer review, citation networks, and institutional hierarchies all carry echoes of tribal politics. What distinguishes science is not the absence of these dynamics, but the presence of mechanisms, replication, transparency, falsifiability, that aim to check them. But if the public sees science primarily as a tribal banner, those mechanisms lose credibility outside the tribe, and so the haunting question lingers. If science is to guide humanity through crises, climate change, pandemics, technological risks, it must find a way to transcend the perception of tribal identity. Can it present itself not as left or right, secular or religious, but as a universal method of inquiry? Or will it remain, in the eyes of many, just another tribe, its truth judged less by evidence than by loyalty? One way to see how fragile this boundary is between method and tribe is to look at science during moments of political upheaval. In the early 20th century, Soviet biology became entangled with ideology through the rise of Trofim Lysenko, whose rejection of Mendelian genetics fit Marxist principles of environmental shaping. For years, his views dominated Soviet agriculture, suppressing dissenting voices and setting back genetics research dramatically. In Nazi Germany, anthropological and medical sciences were twisted to support racial theories. These cases are extreme, but they reveal a truth that applies more broadly. When science is seen as serving one tribe, its authority collapses outside that tribe, and sometimes even within it. The Cold War provides another example. Physics became a symbol of national strength, with nuclear weapons programs absorbing immense resources. Scientists in the United States and the Soviet Union operated under extraordinary pressure, their work framed not only as discovery, but as defence of tribal identity at the level of nations. The space race likewise cast science as tribal competition rather than universal endeavour. The irony is that out of this rivalry came genuine breakthroughs, satellite technology, rocketry, early computers, that benefited humanity as a whole. Yet the framing ensured that science was understood by millions not as neutral inquiry, but as the weapon of a side. Even in education, tribal framing has shaped debates. The teaching of evolution in schools has long been a flashpoint, particularly in the United States. The Scopes trial of 1925 pitted modernist and traditionalist identities against one another, with evolutionary biology in the centre. Nearly a century later, similar disputes continue. For many, the resistance to teaching evolution is less about fossil evidence and more about defending tribal values against what is perceived as an external ideology. To reject or accept evolution becomes a marker of identity, not a neutral judgment about data. These examples show how easily science can be swept into human patterns of belonging and suspicion. The danger is not just external rejection, but internal insularity. If scientists dismiss or ridicule entire segments of the population, whether for political, religious or cultural reasons, they risk reinforcing the perception that science is the property of one tribe. The challenge, then, is to uphold rigour without collapsing into uniformity, to welcome diversity of background without sacrificing the standards that make science distinct from belief. What emerges from this view is a humbling paradox. Science is our best tool for transcending tribal limits, yet it cannot escape the tribal instincts of those who practice and interpret it. The very existence of peer review and replication is testimony to the need to guard against bias, because bias is our default. The hope is that acknowledging this humanity openly, rather than pretending science is a flawless oracle, may restore trust beyond tribal lines. The haunting question that follows is whether humility itself can become science's strongest shield, or whether tribal instincts will prove too strong even for the method that once promised to overcome them. Imagine standing at the threshold of 10,000 years ago. On one side lies the world we inhabited for hundreds of thousands of years, small groups, mobile lives, landscapes walked more than owned. On the other side lies something entirely different. The first cultivated fields, the first permanent dwellings, the first signs of surplus that allowed a few people to step away from subsistence and devote themselves to new pursuits. That shift is sometimes framed as humanity's greatest leap forward, but we must also ask whether it was our greatest compromise. The haunting question is this: did civilization save us or break us? The agricultural revolution is often painted as a triumph. By domesticating plants and animals, humans escaped the precarious cycles of wild food supply. Grain fields produced calories more predictably than hunting. Herds offered meat, milk, hides, and traction power. Villages became possible, then towns, then cities. Populations swelled beyond anything imaginable for small foraging bands. The foundations of writing, mathematics, and governance emerged in this new context. Without farming, there would be no pyramids, no libraries, no global cities. Civilization, in the simplest sense, required fields. But archaeology reveals that the transition was neither sudden nor universally embraced. For thousands of years, communities lingered between foraging and farming, blending practices, resisting full commitment. Some groups adopted agriculture only to abandon it later when it proved unstable. The shift was gradual and messy, and perhaps for good reason. Early farmers were often shorter and less healthy than their foraging contemporaries, their skeletons showing signs of malnutrition, arthritis, and infectious disease. Sedentary life with crowded settlements and close proximity to domesticated animals became fertile ground for pathogens. Tuberculosis, smallpox, and influenza all trace their origins to post-domestication societies. The very act of settling down created new vulnerabilities. From one angle, this was a bargain with fate. In exchange for stability and scale, humans accepted narrower diets, harder physical labour, and increased exposure to disease. From another angle, it was a leap into possibility. Agriculture made surplus. and surplus made specialization. Once not everyone had to farm, some could devote themselves to other work, crafting tools, building temples, composing songs, carving myths into stone. The flowering of art and philosophy that we celebrate today would have been unthinkable without that initial compromise. The paradox of civilization lies in this trade-off. On the one hand, it sustained billions. On the other hand, it created stress, inequality, and alienation unknown to small bands of foragers. Hierarchies emerged as surpluses concentrated. Elites stored grain while labourers toiled. Kings and priests claimed divine authority, shaping societies where obedience often mattered more than kinship. For most of history since farming began, the majority of people lived not in freedom, but under systems of taxation, tribute, or labour duty. Civilization delivered stability, but not always fairness. Archaeologists describe early cities like Uruk or Mohenjo-Daro as marvels of organisation. Streets, granaries, temples, plumbing systems. But they also reveal inequality written into the very architecture. Centralised power required new forms of control, and control brought conflict. Wars over land and resources became common. Walls rose not only to protect from outsiders, but to hold insiders in line. Foragers had known conflict too, but rarely on such scales. Civilization made possible both cathedrals and empires, both beauty and conquest. Yet to reduce the story to tragedy alone would be misleading. Human creativity flourished under these new conditions. Writing emerged not as poetry, but as bookkeeping for grain, yet it gave us literature and philosophy. Monumental architecture, funded by surplus, gave us wonders like Stonehenge, Angkor and Machu Picchu. Systems of law, though often harsh, created predictability that small groups could not have sustained at larger scales. In short, civilization made humanity more than it had been before, but at a price. From the perspective of evolutionary mismatch, the trade-off still shapes us today. Our bodies and minds remain tuned to forager rhythms, yet our environments reflect millennia of urban and agricultural legacy. We carry immune systems primed for pathogens introduced by livestock. We inhabit social structures shaped by surpluses and hierarchies, not by kinship alone. The stress of crowded, unequal societies echoes through modern life in ways our ancestors would not have recognised. The compromise made 10,000 years ago is still unfolding in our bones and institutions. The humbling reality is that we cannot step outside this bargain. Without agriculture and civilization, none of us would be here. Billions of lives are possible only because of those early decisions to settle fields and build towns. At the same time, the costs, disease, inequality, alienation cannot be wished away. They are the shadow side of the very abundance we prize. And so we arrive at the haunting question: did civilization save us, or did it break us? Perhaps the answer is that it did both, and that humanity now lives forever in the balance of that choice. The fields of 10,000 years ago echo in the skyscrapers of today. Whether we thrive within them or collapse under their weight remains uncertain. One way to appreciate the magnitude of this bargain is to notice how many times it was struck independently. Agriculture did not emerge in a single cradle, and then spread outward in neat lines. Instead, it appeared in multiple places, each with different plants, climates, and societies, suggesting that the pressures driving it were widespread. In the Fertile Crescent, wheat and barley anchored the first farming villages. In East Asia, rice and millet sustained growing populations. In the Americas, maize, beans, and squash became the three sisters that fed Mesoamerican civilizations. In Africa, sorghum and yams supported communities long before contact with Eurasia. Each case shows humans making the same essential calculation: stability through cultivation, even at a cost. The archaeological record shows that farming was not always inevitable. Foragers who lived near fertile farming regions sometimes resisted adoption for centuries. Why? Because the benefits were not always immediate. Farming tied people to plots of land, exposed them to seasonal failures, and demanded year-round labour. Foragers who enjoyed diverse diets and mobility could easily see farming as a burden. Only when population density rose, or wild food declined, did the trade-off begin to make sense. In this way, civilization was not so much a leap forward as a corner turned under pressure. Another perspective is ecological. Farming allowed humans to multiply, but it also reshaped entire landscapes. Forests were cleared, rivers diverted, soils tilled until exhausted. Domesticated plants and animals spread across continents, displacing wild species. In ecological terms, agriculture was the beginning of humans acting as a planetary force. The rise of civilization cannot be separated from the decline of biodiversity, a process that began millennia before the Industrial Age. Here again lies the paradox. The very practices that supported more humans often undermined the ecosystems that sustained them. Civilization also reshaped time itself. Foragers lived by seasonal rhythms, punctuated by migrations and resource cycles. Farmers introduced the calendar, dividing time into planting, harvesting, and storage. This change might seem trivial, but it created new ways of organizing human life. Deadlines, schedules, obligations that extended years into the future. Archaeologists studying early Mesopotamian tablets find records of grain owed months later, debts and obligations tracked with clay marks. Civilization brought not only surplus but bureaucracy, not only food security but anxiety about obligations stretching beyond one's immediate kin. What is humbling is how irreversible the trade-off became. Once populations swelled beyond the carrying capacity of foraging, there was no going back. Even when individuals abandoned farms during droughts or wars, the system as a whole kept expanding. The trade-off was locked in, shaping generations who could not imagine an alternative. We live within that legacy still, beneficiaries of stability, inheritors of its burdens. And so, the haunting question grows sharper. If civilization was the trade we made, are we its masters, or are we the ones who are mastered by it? Did we shape fields, or did the fields shape us? The evidence so far suggests both are true. Evolution is a story told in deep time, carved into bones and genes over hundreds of thousands of years. Yet we now live in a world where change unfolds in decades, not millennia. Technology transforms landscapes overnight. Medicine alters lifespans in a single generation, and climate change shifts the conditions of survival faster than any past ice age. In this context, a haunting question emerges. Are we still evolving, or has the process that shaped us slowed to a halt? On one side of the debate are those who argue that natural selection has weakened. For most of human history, survival and reproduction were precarious. Disease, famine, predators, and injury filtered out traits that hindered endurance or fertility. Today, many of those pressures are softened or removed. Antibiotics cure infections, fertility treatments overcome reproductive barriers, and global food networks prevent famine in many regions. If survival no longer depends tightly on genetic variation, the classic Darwinian mechanism seems muted. Evolution, in this view, trudges along faintly if at all. Yet the story is more complicated. Evolution does not require catastrophic pressures. It only requires differential reproduction. Even small biases accumulate over time. Population genetics studies show that subtle selection continues. For example, genes associated with lactose tolerance have spread rapidly in populations that consume dairy, even in the last few thousand years. Genes affecting altitude tolerance in Tibetans and Andeans have shifted frequencies within similarly short spans. These are not ancient shifts locked in the Stone Age, but ongoing adaptations visible in the Holocene and beyond. The suggestion that evolution has ceased underestimates its persistence. The modern environment introduces new selective pressures, though they are often indirect. Urban living, for instance, exposes people to pollutants, noise, and crowding. Some genetic variants may confer resilience to these stresses. Diets rich in processed foods may create metabolic pressures that shape reproductive success in subtle ways. Global migration mixes gene pools, creating combinations never before tested in natural selection. The speed of cultural and environmental change complicates the picture, but it does not erase the underlying logic. If some individuals have more surviving children than others, evolution continues. Another dimension is cultural and technological evolution, which proceeds far faster than genes. Glasses compensate for poor eyesight, insulating that trait from selection. Digital tools augment memory, reducing the selective advantage of mental recall. Gene editing, if widely adopted, could bypass the randomness of mutation altogether, introducing traits by deliberate design. From this perspective, the center of evolution is shifting. Biological change still occurs, but cultural and technological systems increasingly direct human adaptation. Instead of waiting for natural selection, we adjust environments, tools, and medicines to fit our needs. Some thinkers argue that this represents a new phase, self-directed evolution. Whether through selective breeding in agriculture, reproductive technologies in humans, or the emerging possibilities of synthetic biology, humans are no longer only shaped by evolution, but are beginning to shape it consciously. The ethical implications are profound. Who decides which traits are desirable? How do we guard against inequality if only some can afford enhancements? And what unforeseen consequences arise when altering complex systems with limited foresight? The possibility of human-directed evolution raises as many questions as it answers. Yet even as we imagine futures of genetic engineering, the humbling truth remains that we cannot predict which traits will matter most. Climate change may reshape selection by altering environments rapidly. Rising sea levels, shifting disease vectors, and food instability could favour resilience in ways we cannot anticipate. Technology may buffer some of these pressures, but not all. In this sense, the future of human evolution is entangled with the fate of our civilization. We may adapt not through genes alone, but through how well we manage the world we have built. There is also the role of drift, the random fluctuation of traits over generations. In large populations, drift has less impact, but in small or isolated groups, it can produce significant changes. Global connectivity reduces isolation, but genetic substructures still exist. Religious communities with high birth rates, for example, may shift genetic frequencies simply by differential reproduction. These quiet, subtle processes remind us that evolution is not dramatic by default. Sometimes it is the accumulation of small biases invisible until centuries later. The haunting question, then, is not simply whether we are still evolving, but in what direction. Are we drifting toward greater dependence on technology, creating a species that survives less by biology than by culture? Are we accumulating traits that would once have been lethal, sustained now by medicine and infrastructure? Or are we adapting in ways we do not yet see, responding to pressures so new and fast that their consequences remain hidden? We should be cautious not to imagine ourselves outside evolution, as if we have stepped off its stage. Evolution is not a choice, but a process. The fact that we debate it, study it, and imagine its future is itself a product of the brains evolution gave us. Perhaps the question is not whether we are still evolving, but whether we can learn to live with the paradox, a species shaped by ancient pressures, now altering its own environment so profoundly that it may become the primary agent of its own future. To ask whether humans are still evolving is also to ask how flexible evolution itself can be in the face of cultural dominance. One concept often discussed in evolutionary biology is gene-culture coevolution, the idea that cultural practices can generate entirely new selection pressures. The domestication of cattle, for example, created a steady source of milk, which in turn favoured the spread of lactose tolerance genes in some populations. Today, similar feedback loops may still be at work. Urban environments filled with artificial light, pollution, and sedentary routines could be exerting quiet selective forces, even if we do not yet see their long-term outcomes. The biological consequences of living in megacities may only become visible over centuries. There is also the matter of reproductive choices. In forager bands, reproduction was largely shaped by ecological limits, nutrition, child mortality, seasonal cycles. In modern societies, birth rates are influenced by education, access to contraception, economic opportunity, and cultural norms. Some communities maintain high fertility, while others approach demographic decline. These differences alter the relative contributions of populations to future gene pools. Evolution, in this sense, is still operating, but it is mediated by values and choices as much as by biology. This is a departure from the past, but still consistent with the principles of differential reproduction. Another area of ongoing research is immunity. Global travel and interconnected populations expose humans to pathogens from across the world. Pandemics, such as influenza or COVID-19, highlight how quickly diseases can sweep through societies. While medicine reduces mortality, not all individuals respond equally to infection or vaccination. Variations in immune response shaped by genetics may still influence survival and reproduction, albeit in subtle ways. Pathogens evolve rapidly, and humans continue to adapt in return, even if the scale of impact is reduced compared to earlier centuries. Some scientists suggest that the greatest changes in human evolution may come not from external pressures, but from our own interventions. The mapping of the human genome, advances in gene therapy, and the potential for editing embryos all create the possibility of bypassing natural selection entirely. In such a scenario, humans could accelerate adaptation, introducing traits deliberately. Yet this raises a paradox. Is guided genetic change still evolution, or is it something else entirely? The boundaries blur when culture, technology, and biology intertwine so tightly. What remains clear is that humans are unlikely to remain static. Whether through drift, subtle selection, or deliberate intervention, change will occur. The form it takes may differ from the slow rhythms of the Pleistocene, but the principle that populations shift over generations is unavoidable. The haunting question is not whether we are evolving, but whether we will recognize the shape of the humans who come after us, and whether they will still see themselves as us at all. Picture yourself at night, sitting in a quiet apartment high above a city of millions. Outside, the glow of artificial light hides the stars. Sirens and traffic echo where once there would have been owls or wolves. Yet inside your head, the mind that listens is not new. It is old, so old that it was built for caves and small firesides, for a few dozen faces known by name, for rhythms of hunger and plenty, for the sound of predators in the dark. We are in every measurable sense the last cave people. The haunting question is this: what does it mean to carry Stone Age minds into a city world? The evidence of our mismatch is everywhere. Our bodies still respond to stress with adrenaline and cortisol, as if a lion lurked outside the door. Our eyes still dilate in darkness, even though electricity guarantees we need never fear stumbling into predators. Our brains crave sugar, salt, and fat, rewards from a world of scarcity, though now they surround us in abundance. Even our sleep is tuned to firelight and moonlight, yet we flood our nights with blue-lit screens. It is as though evolution trained us for one test, and civilization handed us another entirely. But being misfit cave people is not only a problem, it is also a clue to our resilience. Our ancestors survived droughts, ice ages, and volcanic winters. They crossed deserts, rivers, and mountain ranges with tools no more sophisticated than stone blades and wooden spears. They endured climates and crises far harsher than most of us will ever know. The fact that we still carry those Stone Age instincts suggests not fragility, but endurance. We are here because cave people endured, and because their instincts carried them through. What we have lost is the scale of a life that shaped us. For most of history, humans lived in groups small enough to know every voice. Stories, gossip, and songs bound those groups together. Decision-making was local, conflict resolved face to face. Today, we inhabit societies of millions or billions, where strangers govern us and most voices remain unknown. That shift has created alienation, but it has also made possible art, science, and technology on a scale our ancestors could not imagine. The paradox of being cave people in a city world is that we lost intimacy to gain possibility. There is a temptation to romanticize the past, to imagine that foragers lived lives of leisure and health compared to the stresses of modernity. Yet the archaeological record reminds us otherwise. Life in caves was short, vulnerable to injury, infection, and hunger. Children often died young. Elders were rare. We must resist the illusion that our ancestors lived in utopia. What they did live in, however, was a world their minds were well matched to. Their fears fit their environment. Their stress was acute rather than chronic. Their communities were small enough to sustain trust. In that sense, the mismatch of today is real, not because the past was perfect, but because the present often confounds instincts that once worked well. When we call ourselves the last cave people, we are not saying we should return to caves. That is neither possible nor desirable. We are saying that we must live with the tension of ancient minds in modern worlds. The city around us is built of steel and glass, but inside our neurochemistry still answers to shadows and whispers, to belonging and loss. The skyscraper is new, but the heart that beats within it is old. So what does this mean for the future? It means humility. We cannot assume that technology alone will solve the problems of mismatch. Medicine can extend life, but it cannot erase anxiety rooted in evolutionary logic. Cities can provide abundance, but they cannot undo cravings shaped by scarcity. Social networks can connect billions, but they cannot overwrite the trust systems of small tribes. To live as cave people in a city world is to live with paradox and to admit that we do not have all the answers. Perhaps the lesson of being the last cave people is not despair, but perspective. If our ancestors could survive an ice age with fire and stone, then we can survive the mismatches of the 21st century. If they could endure scarcity, we can endure abundance. If they could carry the weight of fear at night and still tell stories by the fire, then we can carry our own anxieties and still build art, science, and compassion. The mismatch is real, but so is the resilience. And so we close on the haunting question: what will future sapiens make of us? Will they look back and see us as misfits, struggling with instincts in an environment of our own making? Or will they see us as the bridge between the cave and whatever comes next, the generation that learned how to carry ancient minds into new worlds? The truth is that we do not know. What we do know is that every person alive today is the descendant of survivors, cave people who endured, and that their fire still burns in us. There is another way to see ourselves as the last cave people, not by what we have lost, but by what we still preserve. Even in the densest cities surrounded by noise and concrete, humans seek out fragments of the ancestral world. We plant trees in parks. We keep animals in our homes. We gather around glowing screens as if they were firelight. Weekends are spent hiking, camping, or simply walking. Rituals that reconnect us with landscapes our bodies still remember. Even the popularity of meditation, yoga, and mindfulness can be read as attempts to recreate rhythms of attention that our ancestors once practiced instinctively while tracking, waiting, or gazing into flames. In these behaviours we glimpse continuity, a reminder that the cave never fully left us. Our storytelling too is deeply ancestral. Myths, novels, films, and digital games are filled with archetypes drawn from a world of small groups and immediate dangers. Heroes set out on quests, tribes battle over scarce resources, families protect one another against predators and outsiders. The scale may be cosmic, but the structure is Stone Age. In a sense, every time we tell stories we step back into the cave, gathering around the symbolic fire of imagination. What we have also carried forward is cooperation. Despite our conflicts, humans remain the most cooperative primate. We form organisations, charities, scientific collaborations, and global aid networks. That instinct for cooperation, born in caves and camps, is what allows billions to coexist today, however imperfectly. If our minds are mismatched to cities, they're also wired for empathy, and that wiring gives hope that we can manage the challenges of modern life. The irony is that the very traits that make us misfits in a modern world, anxiety, craving, tribal loyalty, are the same traits that once secured our survival. Fear of the dark kept us cautious. Craving for fat and sugar helped us endure winters. Tribal loyalty held groups together when resources ran short. None of these instincts are mistakes. They are the echoes of strategies that worked long before cities, before writing, before civilization itself. The challenge now is not to erase them, but to understand them, to live with them consciously rather than blindly. In that sense, calling ourselves the last cave people is less an indictment than an invitation. It reminds us that beneath skyscrapers and satellites, we remain a species forged in firelight, kinship, and survival. It asks us to look inward with humility, recognizing both the wisdom and the limits of instincts that carried us this far. And it invites us to carry those instincts forward with care, not as relics to be discarded, but as companions on the path toward whatever comes after the cave. Thank you, fellow sapiens, for wandering this timeline with me, for drifting into deep time, for slowing down and remembering. If this helped you fall asleep, helped you study, or simply helped you step out of the noise for a while, thank you for being here. If you think more people should know this story, you know what to do. Like, subscribe, share it with the sapiens in your life, and tell me, are you listening before bed, while working, or somewhere in the world I can only imagine? And as always, stay curious, stay calm. I'll see you in the next story.